On a certain dusk in 241 BC, a battered fleet sailed into the port of Carthage. The scorched and blackened impact marks on the ships had yet to fade, and the broken masts groaned lowly in the evening breeze. These were the surviving Carthaginian warships, after the Battle of the Agates Islands, the last major naval engagement of the First Punic War, which ended in a devastating defeat for Carthage. After 23 long years of war, Carthage had lost Sicily, its naval supremacy, and was burdened with a suffocating war indemnity, the payment of 3,200 talents of silver to Rome over 10 years. Merchants and sailors along the harbor silently watched the returning wrecks. Perhaps no one could foresee that this defeat would tear a rift in the city's political fabric, and from that rift would emerge a military family whose creed was vengeance. To comprehend what this defeat meant for Carthage, one must first understand Carthage itself. This was not a city, state founded on land and farmers. Carthage was the largest commercial empire in the Mediterranean, its power built upon sea routes, ports, and trade networks, descended from colonists of its Phoenician mother city, Tyre. This North African city inherited a sophisticated commercial logic, controlling straits, monopolizing trade routes for tin and silver, and maintaining military power with mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. Its political system was an oligarchic republic, with 2 suffetes serving as the highest magistrates, while the Senate, a council dominated by powerful merchant families, held the core decision-making authority over finance and diplomacy. This system functioned well in peacetime, with commercial profits sufficient to cover mercenary wages and fleet maintenance. But war exposed its fatal flaw when the treasury was depleted by prolonged conflict and mercenary pay could not be met. The entire structure would collapse from within. The collapse came faster than anyone had anticipated. After the war, Carthage faced a thorny reality. Tens of thousands of mercenaries withdrawn from Sicily were awaiting their overdue pay. These soldiers, hailing from Libya, Numidia, Iberia, Gaul, and the Balearic Islands, had shed blood for Carthage and now demanded the promised compensation. The Senate's response, however, was delay and attempts to lower the payment. According to Polybius, Carthaginian authorities even tried to persuade the mercenaries to forgo part of their owed wages, a short-sighted stinginess that ignited a rebellion that nearly destroyed Carthage. From late 241 BC to 238 BC, the mercenaries revolted under the leadership of the Libyan Mathos and the Campanian Spendius, joined by local Libyan farmers in North Africa, who had long harbored deep resentment under the heavy burden of Carthaginian taxes and grain requisitions. The rebellion spread rapidly, and at one point, Carthage was besieged within its walls, facing imminent destruction. It was during this crisis, later known as the War Without Faith, that Hannibal Barca first stepped into the center of the historical stage as the savior of Carthage. Hannibal was no unknown figure. In the final stages of the First Punic War, he had employed guerrilla tactics to tie down Roman forces in Sicily for years, making him one of the few Carthaginian commanders who remained undefeated. However, the war ended through diplomatic negotiations rather than a decisive battlefield victory, forcing Hannibal to implement surrender terms he personally opposed. The mercenary rebellion gave him a chance to prove himself once more, leading Carthage's remaining citizen soldiers and loyal troops. He systematically and ruthlessly crushed the rebels. According to Polybius, in the final battle, the rebels were trapped in a canyon and annihilated after exhausting their supplies. The suppression of the rebellion lasted over 3 years, and its brutality shocked even Polybius, who described it as a savage conflict in which both sides abandoned all rules of war. The victory in suppressing the rebellion earned Hamilcar significant political capital, but it also deepened the rift between him and the Carthaginian Senate. the conservative faction within the Senate, led by Hanno, often referred to by later historians as the Hanno faction, advocated for Carthage to return to its traditional commercial routes, consolidate its hinterland in North Africa, and avoid further conflict with Rome. Hamilcar, on the other hand, represented a different perspective. Carthage's security could not rely solely on commercial profits and diplomatic compromises. It required the establishment of a military force independent of the Senate's financial control. The divide between the two factions was not merely a dispute over strategic direction, but also a struggle over the structure of power. The Senate feared that a military family with its own independent army and financial resources would fundamentally alter the balance of power within Carthage's oligarchic republic. This concern was not without reason. However, we must pause our narrative here to examine the historical sources we rely on. The descriptions of Carthage's internal political factions primarily come from Polybius and later Roman historians like Livy. Although Polybius is known for his rigor, his information channels were mainly within Roman elite circles and networks of pro-Roman Greek intellectuals. Carthage's own political archives, records of Senate debates, and correspondence of the Barca family, if such documents ever existed, were reduced to ashes with the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. The framework of opposition between the Hannonic faction and the Barcid faction that we see could be a reasonable summary of genuine political divisions. Or it might be the result of Greek and Roman historians projecting their familiar political categories onto a foreign system they did not truly understand. This dilemma of historical sources will run through the entire story of Hannibal. Nearly every detail we recount has passed through the eyes and pens of his adversaries. In 237 BC, Hamilcar made a decision that would alter the course of Mediterranean history. He led his army across the sea to the Iberian Peninsula. On the surface, this was to establish a new resource base for Carthage, compensating for the economic losses after losing Sicily and Sardinia. Southern Iberia was rich in silver mines, particularly the veins near Cartagena, which, according to Diodorus, produced such abundant yields that they drew the attention of the entire Mediterranean world. However, Hamilcar's true intentions clearly went beyond this. What he established in Iberia was not an ordinary colonial outpost, but a semi-independent military and political entity. He conquered local tribes by force, won over tribal leaders through marriage alliances and diplomacy, and used silver revenues to directly fund a professional army loyal to the Barcid family, rather than the Carthaginian Senate. This was a state within a state, operating more along the lines of the military monarchies of the Hellenistic era than Carthage's traditional commercial oligarchy. Young Hannibal grew up in this environment. According to the traditional account relayed by Livy, Hannibal crossed the sea to Iberia with his father at the age of 9 and never returned to Carthage proper thereafter. His childhood and youth were not spent in the aristocratic mansions of Carthage, but in the military camps of Iberia on the march, and in tents during tribal negotiations. His teachers were not rhetoricians or philosophers, but Libyan veterans, Numidian horsemen, and Iberian guides. What he learned was not the art of senatorial debate, but how to establish command authority in a multilingual, multi-ethnic mercenary army. This upbringing shaped a man vastly different from the elites of Carthage proper. He was an aristocrat of the camp, an heir raised on the frontiers of the empire, rather than at its center. The most famous story about Hannibal's early years is undoubtedly the altar oath. According to Polybius, who claimed this information came from Hannibal himself, recounted in his later years at the court of Antiochus III, Hamilcar brought the young Hannibal to a temple before departing for Iberia, making him swear at the altar never to be a friend to Rome. Livy's version is even more dramatic, imbuing the scene with a sense of ritual and the weight of destiny. This story was widely circulated in the Roman world, almost becoming the standard narrative starting point for explaining the cause of the Second Punic War. The war originated from a deep-seated hatred instilled in a son by a Carthaginian general. However, we have reason to be cautious about the function of this story. It serves Rome's narrative needs all too perfectly, attributing the responsibility for the war to the personal vendetta of the Barca family, rather than the inevitable structural conflict between two expanding Mediterranean powers. Even if the oath did indeed take place, its meaning may not be as singular as Roman historians have portrayed. A general who, undefeated in war, is forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty and harbors resentment toward the victor is not an anomaly in any era. Hamilcar's anger may have been genuine, but reducing the entire war to a father's legacy of hatred is a crude oversimplification of historical complexity. The roots of the Second Punic War lie deep in the power vacuum left by the First Punic War. After the conflict, Rome took advantage of Carthage's entanglement in a mercenary revolt to forcibly seize Sardinia and Corsica while imposing an additional indemnity of 1,200 talents, an act even Polybius acknowledged lacked justification. Structural contradictions were already in place. Personal hatred was, at most, a catalyst, not the cause. In 229 BC, Hamilcar died in battle against an Iberian tribe. While historical accounts vary regarding the details of his death, the outcome was clear. The Barcid enterprise in Iberia did not come to an end. The army proclaimed Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal, often referred to as Hasdrubal the Fair, to distinguish him from Hannibal's younger brother of the same name. As the new commander, Hasdrubal's approach differed from that of his father-in-law, favoring diplomacy over military conquest. He founded the city of New Carthage, present day Cartagena, as the capital of the Iberian territories, reached an agreement with Rome, establishing the Ebro River as a boundary, and strengthened ties with local tribes through marriage alliances. Under his governance, the Barcid holdings in Iberia evolved from a military outpost into a mature political entity, complete with cities, ports, mining operations, and an administrative system. During this period, Hannibal grew from a youth into a young officer. He served under Hasdrubal, participating in numerous military campaigns against Iberian tribes, where he gained practical combat experience and earned the respect of his troops. According to Polybius, Hannibal was deeply beloved by his soldiers. He ate and slept alongside them, demanded no special privileges during marches, and always positioned himself in the most dangerous spots during battles. This leadership style was no accident. In an army composed of multi-ethnic mercenaries, a commander's authority could not rely solely on lineage or appointment. It had to be earned through day after day of shared marches and battles. Hannibal clearly understood this well. He may have inherited his strategic vision and animosity toward Rome from his father, but in the Iberian camps, he independently forged something even more valuable: the personal charisma and command ability that made soldiers of different languages and cultures willing to die for him. In 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated. The assassin was reportedly a Celt, possibly motivated by personal vendetta. The army immediately proclaimed the 25-year-old Hannibal as their new commander with overwhelming acclamation, and the Carthaginian Senate later ratified the decision. This sequence itself spoke volumes. The true source of power lay with the Iberian army, not the council chambers of Carthage. Thus, a young man who had grown up in military camps and never experienced domestic politics inherited the military machine built over 2 decades by his father and brother-in-law. Before him lay 2 paths: continue Hasdrubal's steady course of consolidating Iberia, accumulating wealth, and maintaining a fragile peace with Rome, or embark on a more perilous road, transforming his father's wrath and the family's military capital into a war that would reshape the Mediterranean. History tells us he chose the latter. But at that moment in 221 BC, the choice had not yet been made, and a 25-year-old commander stood at the frontier of his empire, facing a future filled with both possibility and peril. Looking back over these 26 years, from Hannibal's birth in 247 BC to his assumption of military command in 221 BC, we see not the story of a genius emerging out of nowhere, but rather a family seeking a path forward amid the wounds of an empire. The defeat in the First Punic War tore apart Carthage's political consensus. The mercenary revolt exposed the fragility of its oligarchic system, and Rome's opportunistic seizure of Sardinia closed off any possibility of peaceful coexistence. Hamilcar's establishment of a state within a state in Iberia was both a response to these traumas and a challenge to Carthage's traditional political order. What Hannibal inherited was not just an army and a territory, but an entire historical legacy woven from failure, anger, and ambition. And the boy who swore an oath before the altar, whether the oath truly happened or not, has become a symbol. In the victor's narrative, he is the embodiment of hatred. In the silent ashes of the defeated's archives, he may simply have been a man trying to secure a space for his civilization to survive. We can never know for certain which is closer to the truth. This is precisely what makes telling Hannibal's story so difficult, and why it is worth telling. In the winter of 221 BC, the Mediterranean sun shone over the unfinished docks of New Carthage. As harbor 25-year-old Hannibal Barca stood at the heart of the city his father had built, assuming supreme command of the Iberian expeditionary force. This was no peaceful transfer of power. His brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, had just been assassinated, and the army, through acclamation, had entrusted leadership to this young man, raised in the military camps. The Carthaginian Senate, in distant North Africa, merely ratified the fait accompli. Afterward, this detail is worth pausing over. It meant that after more than 2 decades of Barca family rule in Iberia, a military succession mechanism, independent of the homeland's political processes, had been established. The soldiers' support, not the Senate's appointment, was the true source of authority. From day one, Hannibal was not a general dispatched by the Republic of Carthage, but the heir to a semi-independent military domain. This identity would profoundly shape the scope and limits of every strategic decision he made thereafter. Hannibal inherited not a ready-made elite force, but a multi-ethnic armed collective that needed to be forged through war itself. His father Hamilcar and brother-in-law Hasdrubal had spent nearly 2 decades incorporating vast regions of southern and eastern Iberia into Carthaginian influence through conquest, alliances, and trade. However, the Celtic Iberian tribes of the peninsula's interior remained defiant, with their mountain strongholds scattered across the land. Every conquest risked being erased by rebellion with the next rainy season. Hannibal's first decision upon taking command was not to gaze eastward toward Rome, but to launch 2 intensive inland expeditions to the west and north. According to Polybius, between 221 and 220 BCE, he captured Althea, the capital of the Orcades, and Salamantica, a key stronghold of the Vacae, significantly extending his control to the Douro River basin. These campaigns are often glossed over in later narratives of Hannibal, treated merely as a prelude to the crossing of the Alps. Yet, for Hannibal himself, they were indispensable foundational work. Each victory tested his troops' coordination. Each siege accumulated experience in assaulting fortifications. And every batch of captives and spoils stockpiled resources and manpower for the greater gamble to come. The campaigns of these 2 years also accomplished another, more covert project: the melting pot effect of the army. The composition of Hannibal's troops was almost unparalleled in the ancient world. The core phalanx consisted of Libyan, Phoenician heavy infantry, equipped with Greek-style round shields and spears. These were disciplined professional soldiers recruited from Carthage's North African homeland, Numidian light cavalry, hailing from the Berber tribes of inland North Africa, fought without saddles or shields, using javelins and curved swords to harass and pursue enemies on the flanks, boasting mobility unmatched in the Mediterranean world. Slingers from the Balearic Islands grew up using slings as toys. It is said their mothers would hang bread high up, forcing the children to knock it down with stones to eat. A detail that may be exaggerated. But their long-range precision indeed caused the Roman legions immense trouble in subsequent battles. Add to this the Celtic Iberian infantry and Gallic mercenaries absorbed from the conquest of the peninsula, and Hannibal's army became a mixed force of soldiers who spoke different languages, followed diverse tactical traditions, and operated under entirely different loyalties. Molding such an army into a cohesive unit capable of executing complex tactical maneuvers required not only military talent, but also a rare form of cross-cultural leadership. How did Hannibal maintain the cohesion of this multi-ethnic army? Both Polybius and Livy noted several key methods. First was the immediate distribution of spoils. Unlike the Roman legions, which turned over spoils to the state treasury for allocation by the Senate, Hannibal distributed captured goods directly to his soldiers on the spot after each battle, directly linking personal gain to the commander's victories. Second was Hannibal's personal physical presence. He ate and slept alongside his soldiers, marching at the head of the column rather than riding at the rear. This point was repeatedly emphasized by multiple ancient historians, and even accounting for literary embellishment. The core fact that the Barcid commander led by example to maintain morale stood in stark contrast to the Carthaginian aristocracy's tradition of remotely controlling mercenary forces. Third, and perhaps most importantly, was Hannibal's respect for the tactical strengths of each ethnic group. He did not attempt to standardize all troops into a uniform formation, but preserved each group's most effective combat methods, deploying them with precise timing on the battlefield to fulfill their respective roles. This military philosophy of difference as advantage would repeatedly catch the Romans off guard in the subsequent Italian campaigns. However, when describing this army, we must acknowledge a fundamental dilemma in historical sources. Nearly all information regarding the organization, training methods, and internal management of Hannibal's army comes from Polybius and Livy, two historians with clear pro-Roman biases. Although Polybius is renowned for his rigor and claimed to have consulted the records of Silenus, a Greek historian who accompanied the army, Silenus's original works are lost, making it impossible to verify the accuracy of Polybius's accounts. The military archives of Carthage, if they ever existed, were completely destroyed with the fall of Carthage in 146 BC. This means our understanding of Hannibal's army is essentially filtered through the eyes of its enemies. These enemies had reason to exaggerate the army's barbarity to highlight Roman civilization, as well as to emphasize its elite nature to enhance the prestige of Rome's victory. Between these two opposing narrative motives, the true nature of Hannibal's army may forever remain an approximation. In the spring of 219 BC, Hannibal turned his attention to Saguntum. Located on the eastern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, this city was a Hellenized Iberian settlement, with formidable walls guarding the coastal route north from New Carthage. Its strategic value was undeniable. But what truly made Saguntum a turning point in history was its ambiguous political relationship with Rome. According to Polybius, Saguntum had established some form of friendly ties with Rome before Hannibal's siege, though the legal nature of this relationship, whether it was a formal alliance or an informal protectorate, remains a subject of scholarly debate. Rome later claimed Saguntum as its ally, asserting that an attack on the city was tantamount to a declaration of war against Carthage. On the other hand, insisted that Saguntum lay south of the Ebro River within Carthaginian spheres of influence, and that Rome had no right to intervene. Hannibal chose to act within this legal gray area. He first intervened in Saguntum's internal factional disputes, supporting the pro-Carthaginian side, and then formally launched a siege under the pretext that Saguntum had attacked a Carthaginian vassal tribe. This was not an impulsive military adventure, but a meticulously calculated political provocation. The siege of Saguntum lasted approximately 8 months. It was a brutal war of attrition, far removed from the mobile field operations at which Hannibal excelled. The defenders inside the city, leveraging their advantageous terrain, resisted tenaciously and repeatedly repelled Carthaginian assaults. Hannibal himself was struck in the thigh by a javelin during one of the attacks, forcing him to withdraw from the front lines to recuperate for several weeks. Livy's account of the siege is filled with dramatic details. Defenders pouring molten lead from the walls, and in the final moments, burning their possessions and committing collective suicide. Though the reliability of these details varies. However, the sheer difficulty of the siege itself is likely credible. Notably, throughout the 8-month siege, Rome took no substantive military action to relieve the city, aside from sending envoys to protest to Hannibal. This fact has been repeatedly debated by later historians. Did Rome deliberately abandon Saguntum to gain a moral pretext for war, or was the delay in rescue due to sluggish decision-making within the Senate? Regardless of the answer, the fall of Saguntum objectively provided Rome with a perfect war narrative. A loyal ally betrayed by a treacherous attack, forcing Rome to fight for justice. After the fall of Saguntum, a Roman delegation traveled to the city of Carthage, staging one of the most dramatic scenes in the history of ancient diplomacy. According to Polybius, the Roman envoy Quintus Fabius folded his toga into a pouch before the Carthaginian Senate, declaring that it held both war and peace and demanded that the Carthaginians choose. The Carthaginian senators replied, "As you wish," whereupon Fabius shook out his toga and said, "Then it is war." This scene is so neatly constructed, so reminiscent of a rhetorical exercise from a classroom, that there is reason to suspect it has been embellished by later literary tradition. Yet the political message it conveys is genuine. Both sides were already prepared for war, and diplomacy was merely a final formality. The real issue was not who declared war first, but the deeper cause of the conflict. The two Mediterranean powers could no longer coexist in their division of spheres of influence in the Western Mediterranean. The Ebro Treaty attempted to delineate these spheres with a river as the boundary, but the ambiguity of its text was Saguntum truly protected by the treaty? Did the treaty bind the Carthaginian state, or only the Barcid family? Allowed each side to interpret it to their own advantage. Regarding the responsibility for the Second Punic War, ancient historians have long debated, and modern scholars have yet to reach a consensus. Polybius famously distinguished between the causes and the pretexts of the war. He believed the underlying causes were Hamilcar's hatred of Rome and the expansion of the Barcid family in Iberia, with Saguntum serving as the immediate cause, while the diplomatic procedures for declaring war were merely pretexts. Livy, on the other hand, tended to attribute the responsibility to Hannibal's personal ambition and Punic faithlessness. Among modern scholars, some emphasize that Rome's opportunistic seizure of Sardinia and Corsica after the First Punic War planted the true seeds of hatred, while others point out that the anti-Barcid faction in the Carthaginian Senate may never have truly authorized Hannibal to wage war, making the conflict, in a sense, a private decision of the Barcid family. The value of these debates lies not in finding a correct answer, but in revealing a more fundamental historical question, when both sides of a war have motives to reshape the narrative, and when the victor's archives remain intact while the defeated city lies in ashes. The question of who started the war is itself already distorted by power relations. Before departing from the narrative of Iberia, there is an easily overlooked dimension that needs to be added. Everything we have discussed so far, Hannibal's conquests, the siege of Saguntum, the disputes over treaties, all come from Greek and Roman written records. But what about the conquered tribes of the Iberian Peninsula, the Orcads, the Vacae, the inhabitants of Saguntum? How did they view the arrival of the Carthaginians? Archaeological evidence provides some clues. Multiple sites in the southern Iberian Peninsula show that during Carthaginian rule, local urbanization accelerated, trade networks expanded, but there was also a large-scale reinforcement of fortifications, suggesting that conquest was not a peaceful cultural integration, but accompanied by ongoing military pressure. Some Iberian tribes began to imitate the style of Carthaginian coinage during this period, which could indicate economic integration or forced submission. These silent material pieces of evidence cannot tell the full story, but they remind us, in the grand narrative of Rome and Carthage vying for Mediterranean hegemony, the indigenous peoples of the Iberian Peninsula were not mere backdrops but historical actors with their own calculations of interest and survival strategies. Only their voices have vanished even more completely than those of the Carthaginians. In the late autumn of 219 BC, the walls of Saguntum finally crumbled. Hannibal stood atop the ruins of a city scorched by war, holding in his hands not only the victory of a siege, but also a one-way ticket to Italy. Over the past 2 years, he had accomplished 3 things: forging a versatile elite army of mixed troops, consolidating the resource base of the Iberian Peninsula to a level sufficient to sustain an expedition, and, through the Saguntum incident, forcing Rome into a position where it had to respond. Yet, the cost of this ticket was equally clear. The siege of Saguntum had consumed 8 months and incurred significant troop losses. Opposition within the Carthaginian Senate grew increasingly dissatisfied with the Barca family's unilateral actions, while Rome, the opponent he was about to attack, was mobilizing with the full institutional efficiency of a republic. Hannibal might have already realized that the war he was about to launch was not one that could be concluded with 1 or 2 decisive battles. Instead, it would be a prolonged contest testing the will and resource depth of an entire nation. In this contest, tactical genius could win battles, but only institutional strength could win the war. This paradox would unfold on the other side of the Alps in ways he could not foresee. In the early summer of 218 BC, the port of New Carthage still carried the scent of pine resin and leather. Hannibal had already made a decision that most of his contemporaries found incomprehensible. He would not travel by sea. The Mediterranean was a hunting ground for the Roman fleet, and the memory of the Carthaginian navy's destruction in the First Punic War remained vivid. Yet, abandoning the sea route meant he had to lead nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants from the Iberian Peninsula, marching overland across all of southern Gaul, crossing the Alps, and entering the heart of Italy from the north. At the time, no precedent existed for a large-scale army traversing this route. It was not a march, but a gamble. A bet that the Romans would not anticipate it, that the Gallic tribes could be won over, and that the Alps would remain passable before autumn arrived. Before setting out, Hannibal left part of his forces with his brother Hasdrubal to defend Iberia, and dismissed some of the soldiers recruited from the homeland. According to Polybius, he inscribed the details of the expedition's forces on a bronze pillar in the Temple of Lacinia. This inscription later became one of the most trusted primary sources for Greek historians. A man who carved his military ledger into a temple clearly understood that the scale of this march had transcended conventional warfare. He needed both the gods and posterity as witnesses. From Iberia to the Arich Fena, The straight-line distance is just over 1,000 kilometers. But Hannibal was not facing a blank map. North of the Pyrenees, the Gallic world was a fragmented political space composed of dozens of tribes, each with its own calculations of interest. Hannibal had already begun diplomatic efforts before crossing the Pyrenees. According to Polybius, he sent envoys bearing gifts and promises to the chieftains of the tribes along the route, with a simple and direct core condition: allow passage, provide supplies, and the Carthaginians would not plunder your lands. This was not an empty promise. Hannibal understood that the greatest enemy of an expeditionary force was not the opponent ahead, but every hostile village along the long supply line. The tribal diplomacy he had honed over years of campaigning in Iberia now became a crucial asset. However, not all tribes were willing to cooperate. While crossing the Pyrenees, some Iberian soldiers mutinied and fled out of fear of the road ahead. Hannibal did not pursue them. Instead, he actively released more of those who harbored doubts. This decision, seemingly weakening his forces, was in fact a cold-blooded screening. He preferred to cross the mountains with 30,000 men willing to go all the way, rather than 50,000 unreliable troops who might collapse at any moment. The march through southern Gaul proceeded faster than anticipated. Most tribes along the route chose to cooperate or at least remain neutral, largely thanks to the diplomatic network Hannibal had established months or even years in advance. However, when the army reached the banks of the Arachthene River, real trouble emerged. The Arachthene, in its lower reaches, stretched hundreds of meters wide with swift currents, and the Volcae tribe on the opposite shore had assembled their forces, explicitly refusing the Carthaginians' passage. A frontal crossing meant being attacked mid-river, a nightmare for any commander. Hannibal's solution showcased his signature indirect thinking. He dispatched a detachment led by Hanno to cross the river quietly upstream and circle behind the Volcae. Meanwhile, the main force ostentatiously prepared crossing materials, commandeering local boats, felling trees to build rafts, and stitching animal hides into inflatable floats. When Hanno's detachment signaled their readiness with smoke and fire, the main force began the crossing. The Volcae rushed to the riverbank to confront them, only to find flames rising behind them. Caught between two fronts, they quickly scattered. The entire crossing operation was completed within a single day. Notably, transporting the war elephants posed a separate engineering challenge. According to Polybius, soldiers constructed large rafts covered with soil, allowing the elephants to believe they were still walking on land until the rafts were pushed into the river. Some elephants panicked and fell into the water mid-crossing, but managed to reach the opposite bank by wading through, using their trunks to breathe above the surface. This detail is often regarded by later readers as an anecdote, but it reflects a more serious issue. Hannibal's logistics team had to prepare engineering solutions for every unconventional scenario, demonstrating an organizational capability far surpassing the stereotype of barbarian mercenaries. After crossing the Arachthene, Hannibal received unexpected news. The Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the Scipio, who would later defeat him, had landed with his army near Massilia, just a few days' march from the Carthaginian forces. This meant the Romans had detected Hannibal's overland intentions and were attempting to intercept him in Gaul. Hannibal faced a critical decision. Should he engage the Roman legions head on in the plains of Gaul, or continue northward and turn toward the Alps? He chose the latter. This decision has often been interpreted by later generations as avoiding battle, but a more accurate understanding might be that Hannibal's strategic objective was never to defeat a Roman army in Gaul, but to appear on Italian soil and create shockwaves in the heart of Rome's alliance system. A victory in Gaul would not shake Rome's foundations, but a Carthaginian army suddenly emerging on the Po River plain could trigger a chain reaction of rebellion among the Gallic tribes across northern Italy. Strategic objectives determined the direction of the march. When Scipio reached the Carthaginian army's crossing point, he found the camp empty. His opponent had vanished into the northern river valleys. The journey from the Rh Valley toward the Alps represents the most historically ambiguous segment of the entire expedition. Both Polybius and Livy provided detailed accounts, yet their descriptions exhibit significant contradictions in geographical specifics. For over 2 millennia, modern scholars have debated which pass Hannibal actually traversed. The Little St. Bernard Pass, the Col de Clapier, the Montgenfavre Pass, and even the Mont Cenis Pass, each have their advocates, with each side able to cite passages from classical texts in support of their claims. In 2016, an interdisciplinary team of geologists and microbiologists discovered substantial layers of horse manure deposits near the Col de la Traversette. Carbon-14 dating placed these deposits around 200 BCE, providing new material evidence in favor of the Col de Clapier hypothesis, though far from settling the debate conclusively. This ongoing controversy epitomizes the dilemmas inherent in the study of ancient military history. When literary narratives are the sole primary sources, and archaeological evidence remains sparse and open to interpretation, certainty is often the first casualty for scholars. Regardless of the specific route taken, all historical records are highly consistent. On one point, the crossing of the Alps was a survival crisis lasting approximately 15 days. Polybius described narrow mountain paths, scree slopes prone to collapse at any moment, and scenes of mules and horses losing their footing and plunging into deep valleys. The cold of the high-altitude regions was an entirely unfamiliar enemy to soldiers from North Africa and Iberia. However, the deadliest threat came not from nature, but from humans. The mountain tribes controlled every pass and every traversable valley, and their attitude toward this massive foreign army oscillated between friendliness and hostility. According to Polybius, on one occasion, a mountain tribe chieftain lured the Carthaginian army into a gorge under the guise of guiding them, then launched a surprise attack from the high ground on both sides, causing severe casualties. Thereafter, Hannibal placed the baggage train and cavalry in the center of the column, while he himself led the heavy infantry to guard the rear, to prevent similar ambushes from cutting off the formation again. This immediate adjustment to the marching order reflected not textbook tactical principles, but a commander's real-time judgment of specific terrain and specific threats under extreme pressure. The harassment by the mountain tribes persisted throughout the entire crossing, with losses of personnel and livestock every day and every night's encampment requiring fortification. The descent after crossing the mountain pass was equally perilous, if not more so. Polybius recorded a famous scene. During the downhill march, the army encountered a section of the path completely blocked by a landslide. Fresh snow had fallen over old ice, causing soldiers and pack animals to slip and fall toward the cliff edge as soon as they stepped onto it. Hannibal ordered his engineers to set fire to the rocks and then pour vinegar over them to break them apart, carving a passable road out of the sheer cliff face. This detail of splitting rocks with vinegar sparked endless debate in later generations. Was the concentration of acetic acid sufficient to fracture rocks in practice? Was Polybius recounting an exaggerated engineering legend? Modern experiments have shown that pouring a cold liquid onto rocks heated to high temperatures can indeed accelerate thermal fracturing. And the acidity of vinegar may have provided additional chemical erosion. However, the efficiency of the entire process was far less dramatic than literary accounts suggest. Yet, stripped of its legendary embellishments, the core fact remains. Hannibal's engineering team, under extreme conditions, completed a road construction project sufficient for the army to pass through. This required not just brute force, but also systematic engineering organizational skills. When Hannibal's army finally emerged from the Alps and entered the Po River plain in northern Italy, according to Polybius, only about 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of war elephants remained. Compared to the forces at the outset, more than half had been lost. These numbers alone pose a sharp question. How could an army that had suffered such heavy losses launch an offensive deep in enemy territory? The answer lies at the core of Hannibal's strategic assumption. From the very beginning, he never intended to conquer Rome solely with the army he had brought. The Po River plain was inhabited by numerous Gallic tribes that had been conquered by Rome just decades earlier, and they harbored deep resentment toward Roman rule. Among them, the Boii and Insubres had already rebelled before Hannibal's arrival. What Hannibal needed was a spark, not a complete army. He aimed to use the incredible feat of crossing the Alps itself to prove that Rome was not invincible, thereby inspiring a large-scale uprising among the Gauls of northern Italy. This judgment proved largely correct. Shortly after arriving in the Po River plain, a great number of Gallic warriors flocked to his camp. However, the distance between largely correct and completely successful would be measured repeatedly over the next 15 years of the Italian War. In evaluating this march, we must pause the narrative and confront a fundamental methodological issue. Nearly all details of the Alpine crossing come from the pens of Greek and Roman historians. Polybius is the most reliable source, claiming to have walked Hannibal's route himself and interviewed eyewitnesses. Yet, he wrote decades after the events, and his information primarily came from Roman elite circles and the Scipio family. Livy's account is more literary, filled with dramatic embellishments, making it often impossible to distinguish between what originated from lost early sources and what stemmed from his own rhetorical flourishes. Meanwhile, Carthaginian records, if they ever existed, vanished completely with the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE. We possess no Carthaginian officer's march log, no original report from Hannibal to the Senate, and no Punic inscription documenting this expedition. The sole primary document approaching a Carthaginian perspective is the bronze column inscription Hannibal himself erected at the Licinian temple. Yet, our knowledge of it relies entirely on Polybius's retelling. This means that the Alpine story we recount, however vivid, is essentially a version preserved through the linguistic filter of adversaries. The choice of mountain passes, the names of tribes, casualty figures, and even the engineering marvel of splitting rocks with vinegar all bear the imprint of the Greco-Roman narrative tradition. As for the aspects overlooked or distorted by this tradition, we may never recover them. However, even after discounting all necessary historical records, the strategic significance of the crossing of the Alps remains undeniable. With a march deemed impossible, Hannibal completely shattered Rome's strategic expectations. The Roman Senate's original war plan was a two-pronged offensive. One force would attack Iberia to sever the Barca family's stronghold, while another would cross the sea to assault North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. This plan was predicated on the assumption that the war would be fought on battlefields of Rome's choosing. Hannibal's mountain crossing forcibly shifted the theater of war to the Italian peninsula, compelling Rome to transition from the aggressor to the defender, from the active to the passive side. The seizure of this strategic initiative was far more valuable than the tens of thousands lost during the march. Simultaneously, the crossing of the Alps itself became a powerful psychological weapon. If this man could lead war elephants over Europe's highest mountains, what couldn't he do? This shock effect quickly translated into tangible military alliances among the Gallic tribes of northern Italy and deep-seated fear among Roman citizens. When Hannibal arrived at the Po Valley, his hand seemed pitifully weak. Just over 20,000 weary infantry, a few thousand cavalry, and a handful of surviving war elephants. Yet he had already secured the most critical prerequisites for his subsequent 3 years of continuous victories, strategic surprise, and the psychological destabilization of the enemy. The first clash at the Ticino River would soon test whether these advantages could be transformed into tangible results on the battlefield. In the late autumn of 218 BC, as the mist over the Po Valley had yet to dissipate, a Roman cavalry reconnaissance unit unexpectedly encountered Numidian light cavalry on the west bank of the Ticino River. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the Scipio who would later defeat Hannibal, was riding wounded on horseback, attempting to assess the remaining combat strength of the army that had just stumbled down from the Alpine pass. He soon received his answer. Hannibal gave the Romans no time to catch their breath. The Numidian cavalry flanked them from both sides, and the Roman javelin lines quickly collapsed under the cavalry charge. Scipio himself was severely wounded. According to Livy, it was his 17-year-old son who charged into the chaotic fray on horseback to rescue his father. This skirmish was not large in scale. Strictly speaking, it was merely a cavalry outpost engagement. But the signal it sent was unmistakably clear. Hannibal's army, having crossed the Alps, was not a weary remnant, but a drawn and sharpened blade. When news of the Battle of the Ticinus River reached Rome, the Senate's initial reaction was not panic, but a kind of contemptuous impatience. In the cognitive framework of the Roman aristocracy, a minor cavalry defeat was not worth making a fuss over. The real decisive battle should be fought by heavy infantry formations in open terrain. The other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was leading his army north from Sicily, eager to secure a decisive victory before his term expired at the end of the year. This mindset was not a personal character flaw, but a product of the Roman Republic's political structure. Consuls served only 1-year terms, and military glory could be directly converted into political capital. Waiting meant handing over potential achievements to one successor. Longus needed a battle, and Hannibal was precisely prepared to give him one. In the 2nd of December 18 BC, on the banks of the Trebia River, Hannibal laid his first complete trap in Italy. He first dispatched Numidian cavalry to cross the river before dawn and harass the Roman camp, luring Longus into a hasty attack. The Roman soldiers, without having breakfast, waded through the icy winter river, their soaked clothing and armor clinging to their bodies, causing their body temperature to plummet rapidly. As this hungry and freezing army formed its battle lines on the opposite bank, Hannibal's main force was already in position. At the front was a mixed formation of Libyan heavy infantry and Gallic infantry, with cavalry superiority on both flanks, while his brother Mago led 2,000 elite troops lying in ambush in the riverside bushes. The battle unfolded almost like a pre-rehearsed encirclement. The Roman cavalry was driven from the battlefield. The infantry's flanks were exposed, and Mago struck from behind. Of the 40,000 Roman troops, only about 10,000 managed to break through the center and escape into the city of Placentia. This was not a closely matched contest reversed by a stroke of genius, but a meticulously designed process from luring the enemy and selecting the terrain to deploying ambushes. Yet, we must pause here to examine the sources of the narrative. The detailed accounts of the Battle of the Trebia primarily come from Polybius and Livy, both of whom relied on chains of Roman information. Polybius's advantage lay in his personal connections with the Scipio family, which may have granted him access to first-hand recollections from participants. However, this also means his narrative naturally tends to defend the judgments of the elder and younger Scipios, while placing the blame for the defeat squarely on Longus's recklessness. Any Carthaginian records of the battle, if they ever existed, were lost with the destruction of Carthage. What we possess is a depiction of the battlefield painted by historians from the descendants of the defeated side. It may be quite accurate in tactical details, but its attribution of causes has almost certainly been filtered through a political lens. The crushing defeat at Trebia cast a shadow of anxiety over the Romans throughout the winter. But the machinery of the Republic did not grind to a halt. New consuls took office the following spring, Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius. Flaminius, a populist politician who had championed land distribution laws favoring ordinary citizens, had made many enemies among the senatorial aristocracy. Eager to prove his military prowess, he led his army south to intercept Hannibal, who was crossing the Apennines into Etruria. This urgency was rooted in the competitive logic of Roman politics. A consul from a non-illustrious family needed a victory more than anyone to solidify his political standing. Hannibal seemed to have read this with precision. He chose a difficult route through marshlands into the heart of Etruria, plundering the countryside along the way. A deliberate provocation designed to force Flaminius into a dilemma between political pressure and military caution. In the 2nd of June 17 BC, on the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, this was a terrain pinched into a narrow passage between hills and the lake, with morning fog rising from the water. Visibility extremely low. Hannibal deployed his main forces in the woods on the northern hills, forming an ambush line stretching several kilometers along the passage, leaving only a blocking force at the eastern exit of the passage, when Flaminius led approximately 25,000 Roman troops marching along the lakeshore into the passage. He did not even send out sufficient scouts. Perhaps the morning fog obscured the unusual movements on the hills, or perhaps the fatigue from days of pursuit dulled their vigilance. Hannibal waited until the Roman column had fully entered the ambush zone before giving the signal. The troops on the hills descended like an avalanche. The Roman soldiers had no time to transition from marching formation to battle formation, were split into countless isolated groups, and were slaughtered between the lakeshore and the hillsides. Flaminius himself died in battle, with about 15,000 Roman soldiers killed and 6,000 captured. This was one of the largest ambushes in the history of ancient warfare. 3 battles, 3 distinct tactical logics. The Ticinus River was a direct demonstration of cavalry superiority, overwhelming the enemy's reconnaissance forces with speed and mobility. Trebia was a classic case of luring the enemy deep and encircling them with ambushes, exploiting the opponent's impatience and adverse weather to create an asymmetric advantage. Lake Trasimene represented the ultimate use of terrain, transforming the entire army into a vast net spread between the mountains and the lake. If there is a common thread in these 3 victories, it is that Hannibal had already won each battle before it even began. He won through his precise judgment of the psychological weaknesses of the Roman commanders, his pre-selection of terrain and weather conditions, and his ability to force the enemy to engage under the most unfavorable circumstances. This was not a victory of brute force, but of information and judgment. However, we must also guard against the tendency to interpret every decision of Hannibal's as a deliberate stroke of genius, which may itself be a form of reverse rationalization by later historians who already know the outcome. The randomness of the battlefield, the ambiguity of intelligence, and the on-the-spot reactions of soldiers. These factors are often smoothed over in fluid narratives. When news of Trasimene reached Rome, according to Polybius, the city magistrate stood in the forum and uttered only one sentence: "We have been defeated in a great battle." No embellishment, no explanation. Rome was plunged into its deepest fear since the invasion of the Gauls. But after the fear, the resilience of the Republic's institutions began to show. The Senate activated a rarely used emergency mechanism, the appointment of a dictator. Under Roman constitutional law, the dictator held absolute military command without the checks of the consuls, but his term was limited to 6 months. This was the Republic's greatest concession to centralized power and its final valve reserved for survival crises. The chosen man was Quintus Fabius Maximus, a traditional aristocrat in his 50s, known for his caution, His appointment itself represented a painful shift in Roman political culture. In a society that revered offense and glorified direct confrontation, the Senate selected a man famous for not fighting to save the nation. Fabius's strategy, later named after him as the Fabian strategy, can be summarized in one sentence: refused to engage Hannibal under the conditions he chose. He led his troops to follow Hannibal, always maintaining positions on high ground in the mountains, occupying advantageous terrain, but never descending to fight a decisive battle. When Hannibal plundered the Italian countryside, Fabius endured the complaints of his allies and the ridicule of his soldiers, steadfastly refusing to act. His calculations were based on a cold judgment. Hannibal was far from his homeland, lacked stable supply lines, had no siege equipment, and was unable to capture fortified cities. His army's survival depended entirely on foraging in Italian territory and inciting defections among Rome's allies. As long as Rome refused to offer an opportunity for a decisive battle, time was on Rome's side. This judgment was nearly flawless in military logic, but bordered on political suicide. The political cost of Fabius's strategy was immense. His master of the horse, Minucius, openly accused him of cowardice, and the Roman Popular Assembly even voted to elevate Minucius to the position of co-dictator with equal authority as Fabius, an almost unprecedented move in Roman constitutional history, signifying that public anger had grown powerful enough to distort the system itself. Fabius was mocked by the Romans as Hannibal's lackey. His caution was interpreted as incompetence, and his patience as indifference to the suffering of Rome's allies. It is reasonable to speculate that Fabius himself endured immense inner torment. The path he had chosen required him to remain silent in the face of his countrymen's contempt, stay calm amid the pleas for help from allies, and suppress both his own and his subordinates' urge to fight in response to every provocation from Hannibal. Shortly after gaining independent command, Minucius fell into Hannibal's ambush and was rescued by Fabius, leading his troops. An episode that, in Polybius's account, almost reads like a parable on the virtue of caution. However, we should also note that Polybius's sympathy for Fabius may partly stem from his awareness, while writing, of the later disaster at Cannae. From Hannibal's perspective, Fabian's strategy might have been the first truly formidable opponent he encountered in Italy, not because Fabius was stronger on the battlefield, but because Fabius refused to offer a battlefield. Hannibal's entire strategy was built on the premise of destroying Rome's military prestige through decisive victories in battle, thereby dismantling its system of Italian alliances. Fabius's refusal to engage directly attacked the very foundation of this premise. However, the Fabian strategy also had its own fatal flaw. It could not protect Rome's allied states from plunder, and the loyalty of these allies was precisely the cornerstone of Roman hegemony. Every allied village burned, every allied farmland trampled, silently eroded the trust underpinning Rome's alliance system. Hannibal understood this well. He deliberately bypassed Fabius's private estates during raids while setting fire to the surrounding lands, spreading political rumors of Fabius colluding with the enemy. Here, the war transcended the battlefield, becoming a contest of endurance, trust, and political will. The less than 2 years covered in this chapter fundamentally reshaped the nature of the Second Punic War. At the outset, the Romans anticipated a conventional Mediterranean power struggle, defeating the invader with superior forces on a chosen battlefield, and then carrying the war into enemy territory. Hannibal's 3 victories shattered this expectation. Rome was forced to acknowledge that it faced not an opponent who could be defeated by conventional means, but one capable of turning Rome's institutional weaknesses, the term anxiety of consuls, the competitive pursuit of glory among the nobility, and the emotional volatility of the citizen assemblies, into battlefield advantages in every engagement. The emergence of the Fabian strategy represented a painful, yet crucial self-adjustment of the Roman Republic under existential pressure. It was not perfect, politically almost unsustainable, and would be abandoned the following year by new consuls eager for revenge. A decision that would lead directly to the catastrophe on the plains of Cannae. Yet the very existence of the Fabian strategy proved one thing. Rome's strength lay not only in its legions, but also in its system's ability to generate responses commensurate with disaster, even when those responses defied the deepest cultural instincts of the Romans. The core tension of the war was shifting from tactical confrontations on the battlefield to a prolonged contest between two systems. On an early morning in the 8th month of 216 BC, a hot wind blew from the south across the Apulian plain by the Afonto River. Carrying with it dry, yellow dust, Hannibal stood on the high ground near the ruins of Cannae. Overlooking the battlefield, he had personally chosen a wide open valley plain with almost nowhere to hide. This choice seemed unusual. Over the past 2 years, he had used rivers to set traps at Trebia and at Lake Trasimene, leveraged morning fog and mountain passes to orchestrate the largest ambush in the ancient world. Those victories relied on the deceptive nature of the terrain. Now, however, he had positioned his army on a flat, open expanse, seemingly inviting the Romans to do what they did best: crush their enemy's head, on with overwhelming numerical superiority. This was no oversight. It was a hunter changing the form of his trap, shifting from a terrain-based snare to one crafted from the formation itself. He had likely concluded that the accumulated rage and urgency of the Romans, following their successive devastating defeats, would drive them headlong into a pocket, formed not by mountains or valleys, but by walls of men. To understand why Cannae happened, one must return to the anxious and angry halls of the Roman Senate. After the disaster at Lake Trasimene, Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator, implementing a strategy that deeply humiliated Roman citizens, shadowing Hannibal while refusing to engage in battle, burning the fields he might traverse, cutting off his supply lines, and wearing down the isolated army with time rather than swords. This logic was not without military merit. Hannibal was far from home, lacking a stable logistical port, relying each day on plunder and the support of temporary allies for provisions. Fabius was betting on patience, but Rome was not a republic that easily embraced patience. The citizen-soldier system meant that every farmer toiling in the fields could be conscripted, while their lands were being ravaged by Hannibal's army. The war faction in the Senate, represented by Gaius Terentius Varro, condemned Fabius's caution as cowardice and viewed the delay as a betrayal of Roman dignity. In the consular election of 216 BC, Roman citizens answered with their votes. They elected Varro, who had sworn to confront Hannibal in a decisive battle. The other consul elected in the same year as Varro was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a traditional military man of noble birth and cautious temperament. At this moment, the unique design of the Roman republican system revealed its most dangerous aspect. The two consuls jointly commanded the army, and by convention, they took turns holding supreme command each day. This meant that on the battlefield, the strategic will of the army could undergo a fundamental shift every 24 hours. Paulus favored a cautious approach in selecting battlefields, avoiding engagements in open terrain that favored Hannibal's cavalry. Varro, on the other hand, was eager for battle. According to Polybius, Paulus had expressed concerns about Varro's recklessness, but the system granted both men equal authority rather than entrusting decision, making to the more level-headed one. Thus emerged a question repeatedly pondered by later military historians. Was the disaster at Cannae the result of Varro's personal recklessness, or was it the inevitable collapse of the Roman system of dual consuls alternating command under extreme pressure? The answer may lie in both. The system did not provide sufficient room for error in the extreme scenario of facing a genius opponent. Rome poured an unprecedented military force into this decisive battle in the history of the Republic. According to Polybius, Rome assembled approximately 8 legions and an equal number of Latin allied infantry, along with cavalry, bringing the total strength to possibly between 80,000 and 87,000 men. This number itself was a strategic declaration. Rome was determined to crush Hannibal with overwhelming numerical superiority. In a single blow. In contrast, Hannibal's forces numbered around 50,000, including about 10,000 cavalry. A numerical advantage in cavalry being one of the few structural advantages he held. But numbers only tell the surface of the story. The core strength of the Roman legions lay in the frontal impact of their heavy infantry phalanxes. Citizen soldiers armed with heavy javelins and short swords advancing in tight formations were nearly unstoppable in head-on clashes on open ground. Hannibal's army, on the other hand, was a multi-ethnic composite force. Libyan veterans formed the core of the heavy infantry. Gallic and Iberian warriors filled the center, while Numidian light cavalry and Iberian heavy cavalry were positioned on the flanks. The strength of this army did not lie in the combat power of any single unit, but in the synergy among different troop types, honed over 2 years of campaigning in Italy, and in the judgment of the man commanding them regarding the timing of battle. Before continuing the narrative of the battle, it is necessary to pause and examine the sources of information we rely on. The primary accounts of the Battle of Cannae come from Polybius and Livy. Polybius wrote about 60 years after Cannae, having personally visited the battlefield and spoken with descendants of those who experienced it. His account is widely regarded as the more reliable foundation. Livy, building upon Polybius, added numerous dramatic details, including many dialogues and psychological descriptions, with more evident traces of literary embellishment. The crucial issue is that records from the Carthaginian side are almost entirely absent. What we possess is a narrative of defeat written by the victors, or, more precisely, by the allies and descendants of the ultimate victors. Polybius shows rare respect for Hannibal's military genius, yet his narrative framework remains why Rome ultimately triumphed, rather than how Carthage understood this war. This means that our understanding of the tactical details at Cannae may rely more on inference and reconstruction than on direct battlefield records, more so than we might assume. The 2nd of August, 216 BC, if we accept a traditionally calculated date, was the day Varro assumed command when the Roman army crossed the Aufidus River and deployed on the plains near Cannae. Varro made a deployment decision that was entirely logical under the circumstances. He significantly increased the depth of the infantry line while shortening its frontage. This was not foolishness, facing an enemy with a smaller total force. Increasing the depth meant enhancing the penetrating power of a frontal assault, like an iron nail rather than an iron sheet. His plan was simple. The central infantry, with overwhelming thickness, would pierce through Hannibal's center in a single, decisive blow. The fatal flaw of this plan lay not in itself, but in the fact that it was precisely what Hannibal wanted him to do. Increasing the depth meant shortening the front, and shortening the front meant that the exposed flanks were less protected by the infantry themselves. Meanwhile, the Roman cavalry, significantly outnumbered, was positioned on both wings, tasked with the nearly impossible mission of withstanding the charges of the Numidian and Iberian cavalry in open terrain. Hannibal's deployment is the core reason why Cannae became a classic in military history. He positioned the Gallic and Iberian infantry at the center, forming an arc that bulged toward the Roman direction. These soldiers were not his most elite troops, but they were brave enough to withstand the initial impact of the engagement. At the ends of the arc, where the infantry line connected with the cavalry on both flanks, he deployed the Libyan heavy infantry. These were his most well-trained and best-equipped veterans, many of whom wore armor and weapons captured from fallen Roman soldiers at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Initially, the Libyan infantry were not positioned at the forefront of the battle line, but were angled backward, like two doors not yet closed. On the left flank, Hasdrubal led the Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry against the Roman cavalry. On the right flank, the Numidian light cavalry faced the Roman Latin allied cavalry. The intent of the entire formation, in the simplest terms, was to lure the enemy deep at the center, have the cavalry on both flanks crush their opponents, and then maneuver to encircle, while the Libyan infantry closed in from the sides, trapping the entire Roman army in a pocket. Once the battle commenced, everything unfolded according to Hannibal's script. Though the term script belies the immense risks involved in its execution, the Gaulish and Iberian infantry at the center bore the full brunt of the Roman heavy infantry phalanx. The forward arching curve began to flatten, then gradually concave inward. This process was not instantaneous. It lasted perhaps an hour or even longer, amidst the sweltering heat, dust, and deafening clang of metal. The soldiers at the center had to retreat while maintaining their formation to prevent a collapse. This was the most fragile link in the entire battle. Had the Gauls and Iberians turned their retreat into a rout, Hannibal's entire plan would have crumbled. But they did not rout. We cannot know for certain. What held them together, whether it was pre-battle orders, trust in their commander, or the sheer inertia of being trapped in a crowd with nowhere to flee on the battlefield. Yet they succeeded. The curve shifted from convex to concave. The Roman infantry surged like a torrent into this deepening hollow, their commanders perhaps heartened by the breakthrough at the center, unaware that their army was being gradually swallowed, not by the terrain on either side, but by walls of men. The cavalry engagements on both flanks almost simultaneously decided the fate of the entire battle. On the left flank, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry swiftly overwhelmed the opposing Roman cavalry with superior numbers and momentum, driving them from the field. Instead of pursuing the scattered enemy horsemen, a crucial act of restraint, Hasdrubal led his forces across the rear of the Roman infantry lines, circling to the other side of the battlefield to strike the Roman allied cavalry from behind as they were engaged with Numidian light cavalry. Caught between two fronts, the Roman right-wing cavalry also quickly collapsed. With this, both flanks of the Roman army were completely exposed. Meanwhile, the massive infantry column at the center continued to advance, pushing deeper and deeper, its front narrowing and its sides growing increasingly crowded. Soldiers began to find themselves unable to wield their weapons effectively, with those in the rear pushing the front ranks forward while the front ranks could no longer see where the enemy lines lay. At this very moment, the Libyan heavy infantry pivoted inward from both sides, like two massive iron gates slowly closing, cutting into the exposed flanks of the Roman infantry. The encirclement was complete. Over 80,000 Roman soldiers were compressed into an ever-shrinking space, with resisting Gallic and Iberian infantry ahead, walls of Libyan heavy infantry on both sides, and Hasdrubal's cavalry sealing off the rear. Polybius described what followed with a calmness bordering on cruelty. This was no longer a battle, but a massacre. The trapped Roman soldiers, too crowded to raise their shields or swing their swords, were cut down layer by layer on the periphery, while those in the center trampled each other in panic. According to Polybius's figures, approximately 48,000 Romans died, and about 19,000 were captured. Consul Paulus fell in battle, while Varro escaped with a handful of cavalry. In a single day, Rome lost nearly one-fifth of its adult male citizen population, a number that remains staggering even more than 2 millennia later. Cannae was not merely a military defeat. It was a demographic and psychological trauma that pushed a republic to the brink of survival in just one day. However, it was after this near-perfect battle of annihilation that the logic of the war took a turn beyond Hannibal's control. According to Livy, Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, suggested marching on Rome immediately after the battle and uttered the oft-quoted line, "In 5 days, you will dine on the Capitoline Hill." Hannibal refused. Livy used this to comment, "Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use it." This remark has been passed down for 2,000 years, yet it reads more like a literary aphorism than a military analysis. Hannibal's reasons for refusing to march on Rome were likely far more complex than mere hesitation or error. His army had just endured a costly battle, lacked siege equipment, and had a supply line so fragile it was almost non-existent. Rome had strong walls and still loyal defenders. Storming a well-defended major city was an entirely different kind of warfare compared to annihilating a field army in open terrain. After Cannae, Rome descended into a state of near-collective panic, as described by ancient historians. The streets were filled with women searching for news of their loved ones, and the Senate urgently banned public mourning to maintain order. Yet, panic did not turn into surrender. This is the most thought-provoking part of the entire Cannae narrative. Not how Hannibal won the battle, but how Rome refused to admit defeat after a disaster of such magnitude. The Senate made a series of desperate yet coldly rational decisions, refusing to ransom prisoners of war, thereby signaling to all citizens that captivity is not an option, lowering the minimum age for conscription and incorporating slaves and criminals into the army, and issuing new conscription orders to the cities of the Latin League. Most crucially, when Hannibal sent envoys to Rome to propose peace talks, the Senate refused to meet them. This refusal was not an act of courage, but an institutional judgment. Rome's war potential was far from exhausted, and Hannibal's isolated position in Italy, without a stable rear, meant that time was on Rome's side. The survival of Rome after Cannae was not due to the heroic efforts of any single individual, but rather to a slowly constructed institutional system developed over centuries. The citizen-soldier system meant Rome had an almost inexhaustible reserve of manpower, as long as its citizens still believed the Republic was worth fighting for. The Latin League provided strategic depth beyond the city. State of Rome itself, even if Rome's own fighting-age men suffered devastating losses at Cannae, allied cities could still supply new legions. The reasons these allies did not defect en masse to Hannibal after Cannae were multifaceted. Rome's gradual extension of citizenship rights and trade benefits to its Latin allies created tangible bonds of interest, while Hannibal, as an external invader, could only offer vague alternatives. It is true that some southern Italian cities did switch sides after Cannae, Capua being the most significant. But the core cities of the Latin League remained almost entirely steadfast. This fact alone stands as the strongest testament to the resilience of Rome's institutions. Hannibal's strategic vision was built on a premise that a sufficiently heavy blow on the battlefield would cause Rome's alliance system to collapse like dominoes. Cannae proved he could deliver such a blow, but it also proved that premise wrong. The alliance system did not crumble. Rome's war machine restarted after a brief period of shock, and this time it learned not to engage Hannibal in direct confrontation. Examining Cannae from a military history perspective reveals its significance far beyond the outcome of a single battle. What Hannibal demonstrated on the banks of the Aufidus River was the ability to integrate various tactical elements: cavalry superiority, infantry flexibility, terrain utilization, and psychological manipulation into a unified plan of annihilation. Later military theorists coined a specific term for this mode of warfare, the Cannae model, which entails the complete encirclement of the enemy's main force through flanking maneuvers. From Schlieffen to Guderian, from Clausewitz's theoretical analyses to the U.S. military's left hook maneuver in the Gulf War, the shadow of Cannae repeatedly appears throughout 2 millennia of military thought. However, a methodological pitfall exists here. Subsequent repeated references to Cannae may, in turn, shape our understanding of the battle itself. The narrative of Cannae we read today has inevitably been filtered through 2,000 years of military theoretical tradition. Polybius's original account itself carries the narrative purpose of explaining to Roman readers why they lost. And each subsequent reinterpretation of Cannae has added new layers of meaning to the original text. We must recognize that the conceptual framework of the perfect double envelopment is both a tool for understanding Cannae and a potential barrier that obscures its complexity. After Cannae, Hannibal would remain in Italy for another 13 years. He would win more minor victories, establish a fragile sphere of influence in southern Italy, and wait for a decisive turning point that never came. Meanwhile, under the guidance of Fabius Maximus's strategy of attrition, Rome chose a long, painful, but ultimately effective path, avoiding major battles, cutting off supplies, gradually recapturing cities that had defected, and shifting the war to Spain and North Africa. Cannae was the peak of Hannibal's military career and the starting point of his strategic dilemma. He proved himself one of the greatest tactical geniuses of the ancient world. But tactical brilliance could not solve a fundamental strategic problem. When your enemy refuses to acknowledge that your victory is decisive, victory itself becomes a form of attrition. This paradox would define Hannibal's remaining years in Italy, and ultimately lead him to the long-delayed, inevitable reckoning on the plains of Zama. In the late autumn of 216 BC, before the bones on the battlefield of Cannae were fully buried, a Carthaginian envoy had already appeared at the gates of the council hall in Capua. Capua was the wealthiest city on the Campanian plain, and one of Rome's most important allies in southern Italy. The envoy brought not threats, but a generous proposal for an alliance. Capua would retain full autonomy, would not need to provide troops to Carthage, and only had to close its gates to Rome. The debate within the council hall lasted for several days. According to Livy, the leader of the pro-war faction, Pacuvius Calavius, strongly advocated siding with Hannibal, while opponents warned that Rome's retaliation would be devastating. In the end, Capua chose to betray its old ally. The city's defection triggered a chain reaction across the Italian peninsula. Some tribes of the Samnites, several towns in Apulia, and most of Bruttium successively declared their withdrawal from the Roman alliance. Hannibal seemed to be achieving his core strategic objective, not to capture the city of Rome, but to dismantle the alliance network upon which Rome relied for its dominance. However, the scale of the alliance's collapse was far less complete than Hannibal had hoped. This point is often overlooked in later narratives. Rome's system of alliances in Italy was not merely a matter of simple contracts. It was a layered structure meticulously woven over more than a century. Latin colonies enjoyed rights closest to those of Roman citizens. Italian allies were granted varying degrees of autonomy and trade privileges based on their contributions, while the subordinate cities at the lowest level had little choice. After Cannae, those who truly defected to Hannibal were primarily the southern ethnic groups long marginalized within the alliance system and harboring deep-seated grievances against Rome. Almost none of the Latin colonies rebelled. This fact is crucial. It meant that the core layer of Rome's alliance system, the cities that shared the deepest interests with Rome, remained loyal even at the moment of the empire's most devastating military defeat. Whether this loyalty stemmed from identification or fear remains a subject of debate among historians. But the outcome was clear. Hannibal failed to undermine the foundation of Roman hegemony. For Hannibal, Capua's defection was both a victory and a burden. He now had to protect the city. An expeditionary force without a fixed rear base in Italy suddenly found itself saddled with defensive obligations. The nobles of Capua expected the Carthaginian army to station itself near the city walls, ready to repel any Roman counterattack, while Hannibal's strategic logic demanded that he maintain mobility, continuing to seek opportunities in southern Italy and win over more cities. The conflict between these two demands began to erode his freedom of action from 215 BC onward. He was forced to divide his forces to garrison multiple strongholds, spreading his originally concentrated troops thin along a long front from Campania to Bruttium. An army whose core strengths were mobility and concentration of force was being compelled to assume the role it was least suited for, that of an occupier. Meanwhile, the Roman political machinery demonstrated a nearly ruthless adaptability in the face of crisis. After Cannae, the Senate did not fall into paralysis. They took 3 actions. First, they declared a full mobilization, lowering the minimum conscription age and even arming some slaves and debtors. Second, they reaffirmed Fabius Maximus's strategy of attrition as the fundamental approach, while allowing Marcus Claudius Marcellus to conduct offensive operations on local battlefields. Third, they sent a clear signal to the allied cities that had defected. The price of betrayal would be utter destruction. This third point was no empty threat. In the years that followed, Rome imposed severe punishments on every recaptured rebel city, confiscating land, executing leaders, and forcibly relocating populations. The dual ropes of fear and interest firmly bound the hesitant allies to Rome's side. It is necessary to pause here to examine the historical sources we rely on for the narrative of the Italian theater between 216 and 211 BCE. We depend almost entirely on Livy and Polybius, 2 historians with a pro-Roman bias. The Carthaginian records, whether official archives or accounts by accompanying historians, were permanently lost with the burning of Carthage in 146 BCE. This means that every motive behind the betrayal of the Capuan nobility and every instance of Hannibal's strategic hesitation we read about have been filtered through the perspective of the victors. Polybius at least attempted to maintain analytical restraint, while Livy's narrative is filled with moralizing rhetoric. Cities that defected from Rome are always portrayed as greedy or short-sighted, while loyal allies are endowed with noble qualities. We cannot reconstruct the complete Carthaginian perspective, but we should at least recognize that the seemingly natural causal chains in the current narrative may only be the ones permitted by the surviving historical sources. The role of Marcellus deserves separate examination. If Fabius represented the patient side of Roman strategy, Marcellus was its cutting edge. This 5-time consul was not content with avoiding battles. Starting from 215 BC, he actively sought medium-scale engagements with Carthaginian forces in Sicily and southern Italy, aiming not for decisive victories, but to restore the morale and combat confidence of the Roman legions through repeated skirmishes. According to Polybius, Marcellus repelled Hannibal's attacks 3 times outside the walls of Nola, though the scale and outcomes of these battles may have been exaggerated in Livy's accounts. Yet their strategic significance was real. The Roman army began to relearn how to face Hannibal on the battlefield without collapsing. This psychological recovery complemented Fabius's strategy of attrition. One held the enemy at bay, while the other rebuilt confidence. Rome did not rely on a single genius, but on the coordinated efforts of generals, with different styles within an institutional framework to confront the crisis. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean, political maneuvering within the city of Carthage was draining Hannibal's strategic resources in an almost self-destructive manner. Carthage's political structure was an oligarchic republic, with power concentrated in the hands of a senate dominated by wealthy merchant families. Although the Barcid family had accumulated immense prestige through military colonization in Iberia, they consistently faced opposition in the Senate, led by Hanno. Hanno's faction was not fundamentally anti-war. Rather, they opposed the unlimited investment of national resources in an Italian adventure far from the homeland. They preferred consolidating Carthage's sphere of influence in North Africa and safeguarding its commercial network in the Western Mediterranean. This divide was not merely a clash between hawks and doves, but a fundamental conflict between two imperial strategic visions. Perhaps from Hanno's perspective, Hannibal's Italian expedition was, from the very beginning, the Barcid family's private war, rather than a rational choice for the Carthaginian state. The immediate consequence of this internal division was a severe shortage of reinforcements. Hannibal fought in Italy for over a decade, yet received only a handful of large-scale reinforcements from Carthage itself. According to existing historical records, the major resupply efforts that can be confirmed were mostly limited in scale and intermittent. In contrast, Rome mobilized more than 20 legions within 5 years after Cannae. Even accounting for the exaggeration common in ancient troop numbers, this scale of mobilization far surpassed anything Carthage could match. The crux of the issue lay not only in Carthage's political will, but also in a structural disparity. In capability, Carthage was a commercial empire whose military power heavily relied on mercenaries and allied forces, while Rome's soldier system allowed it to regenerate continuously even after suffering massive losses. This was an asymmetrical war of attrition. For Hannibal, every soldier lost was difficult to replace, whereas Rome could rebuild every lost legion in the next recruitment season. Amid such strategic dilemmas, the question of why Hannibal did not directly attack Rome has been repeatedly asked by later generations. This question itself implies an untested assumption that Hannibal had the capability to capture Rome. In reality, by the end of the 3rd century BC, Rome was protected by the sturdy Servian wall, maintained a permanent garrison within the city, and could quickly receive reinforcements from surrounding Latin colonies. Hannibal's army lacked large-scale siege equipment, and his engineering capabilities were far inferior to those of the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great. More importantly, besieging a major city would have meant immobilizing his mobile forces in one location, precisely giving the Romans the opportunity they most desired: to concentrate their forces from multiple directions and annihilate the besiegers. The famous remark by Hannibal, "You know how to win a victory, but not how to use it," is recorded by Livy as having been made after the Battle of Cannae. However, this statement seems more like a dramatic line constructed by later historians to explain the outcome of the war, rather than an accurate assessment of the military realities at the time. Hannibal's decision not to attack Rome may not have been hesitation, but clarity of judgment. In 211 BC, the Roman siege of Capua entered its final phase. 2 consular armies completely encircled the city with continuous trenches and palisades, cutting off all external supplies. Hannibal attempted a bold feint to relieve the siege. He led his forces directly to the gates of Rome, hoping to force the Roman armies besieging Capua to return and defend the capital. According to Livy, Carthaginian cavalry once appeared outside the gates of Rome, causing widespread panic in the city. However, the Roman Senate made a decision so calm it bordered on ruthlessness. They would not lift a siege. They judged that Hannibal lacked the capability to assault the city, and that this advance was merely a bluff. History proved them right. After lingering outside Rome for several days, Hannibal was forced to retreat, and Capua surrendered shortly after its food supplies were exhausted. Rome's retribution was swift and severe. The city's autonomy was revoked. The nobles who led the rebellion were executed, and vast tracts of land were confiscated as Roman state property. The fate of Capua served as a stark warning, delivering a clear message to all Italian cities still hesitating. The fall of Capua marked a turning point. But this shift did not occur suddenly. It was the cumulative result of a 5-year war of attrition. From 216 to 211 BC, Hannibal's situation in Italy followed a slow and irreversible downward trajectory. Allied cities were gradually recaptured or destroyed by Rome. Troop reinforcements became increasingly difficult to secure. Support from Carthage itself remained consistently insufficient, while Rome's military strength steadily recovered and grew. The war was shifting from the mobile warfare, at which Hannibal excelled, to a systemic competition he was least equipped to handle. A brilliant commander could defeat any opponent on the battlefield, but he could not single-handedly contend with a state apparatus capable of transforming defeat into institutional learning and losses into greater mobilization depth. Perhaps this was the most profound lesson of the 5 years following Cannae. The outcome of a war depends not only on who wins battles, but also on who can endure more failures without collapsing. As Hannibal gazed beyond the hills of Campania toward an uncertain future, his brother Hasdrubal was assembling a new army in Iberia, preparing to cross the Alps and join forces. A final strategic gamble for Carthage in the Italian theater. In the late summer of 207 BC, at a temporary camp in Bruttium at the southern tip of the Italian peninsula, a salted human head was thrown over the fence by Roman cavalry and rolled before Hannibal's tent. It was the head of his brother Hasdrubal. According to Livy, Hannibal gazed at it for a long time and uttered a single sentence: "I see in this the fate of Carthage." This scene was repeatedly recounted by Roman historians, imbued with a dramatic flair crafted by the victors, freezing the enemy commander's despair into a moment fit for legend. Yet, regardless of whether the details were embellished by literary license, the strategic reality it pointed to was undeniable. From that moment on, Hannibal's war in Italy was no longer an expedition with the potential for ultimate victory, but had become an endless, trapped struggle. To understand why the Battle of the Metataurus became the turning point of the entire war, one must look back to the structural challenges Hannibal faced in Italy around 211 BC. 5 years had passed since the decisive victory at Cannae, and the political gains from that annihilation were rapidly fading. The Romans executed a suffocating two-pronged strategy with remarkable patience. Marcellus engaged Hannibal repeatedly in the field, aiming not for decisive victory but to wear him down, while the successors of Fabius's system methodically besieged Italian states that had defected to Carthage. Capua, the wealthiest city in Campania, was recaptured by Rome in 211 BC, with its pro-Carthaginian nobles either committing suicide or being executed, and the city subjected to systematic punishment. Tarentum was similarly retaken by Fabius in 209 BC. The fall of each city sent the same message to the remaining wavering states. The cost of siding with Hannibal far outweighed enduring Roman hegemony. Hannibal was not unaware of this crisis. Over the years, he repeatedly attempted to break Rome's siege network through mobile warfare. In 211 BC, he even led his army directly to the gates of Rome, an event famously known as Hannibal at the Gates. However, the purpose of this advance was not to attack the city. He lacked siege equipment and sufficient troops to besiege a city with intact walls and a large garrison. His intention was to force the Roman army besieging Capua to return and relieve the pressure on his allies. Yet, the Roman Senate made a cold and precise judgment. The army besieging Capua remained in place, while defenses within the city were organized separately. After lingering outside the walls of Rome for several days, Hannibal was forced to retreat. The failure of this operation exposed a fundamental truth: when the Romans no longer made mistakes out of fear. Hannibal's forces were insufficient to threaten multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The issue of troop supply is key to understanding Hannibal's dilemma. His army, which started with about 26,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry when crossing the Alps, grew to a considerable size through captured resources from victories, like Cannae, and local recruitment in Gaul and southern Italy. However, the replenishment mechanism for this army was extremely fragile. Reinforcements from Carthage itself had to cross the Mediterranean, controlled by the Roman navy, or travel overland through Iberia and Gaul before crossing the Alps. Both routes fraught with risks. Meanwhile, the loyalty of locally recruited Italian allies and Gallic tribal warriors was limited. They could often be relied upon when fighting in their own regions, but once far from home, many would desert. More critically, the long-standing hostility of the Hanno faction toward the Barcid family within the Carthaginian Senate never subsided. It is reasonable to speculate that a significant portion of the Senate would rather see Hannibal left to fend for himself in Italy than invest more of Carthage's own resources in his campaign. As a triumphant Hannibal returning home might pose as great a threat to the oligarchy as Rome itself. A methodological pause is necessary here. Our understanding of Carthage's internal politics during this period relies almost entirely on the accounts of Polybius and Livy, whose sources were primarily Roman intelligence and post-war interviews with Carthaginian defectors. Carthage's own archives, if systematic records of Senate proceedings ever existed, were completely lost with the city's destruction. In 146 BC, this means that the specific details of the conflict between the Hanno faction and the Barca faction, as we describe it, may have been filtered through a Roman narrative framework. Roman historians had an incentive to attribute Carthage's defeat to internal divisions, as this both highlighted the strength of Roman unity and preserved due respect for Hannibal's military genius. A genius undermined by his own people fits the victor's narrative better than an opponent defeated outright by Rome. When using these materials, we must remain aware of this filter. It was against this backdrop of scarce local reinforcements that Hasdrubal's expedition plan was put on the agenda. Hasdrubal Barca, the younger brother of Hannibal, had remained in the Iberian Peninsula after Hannibal's departure, engaging in a prolonged tug-of-war with the Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, whom Rome had sent to Spain. In 211 BC, the Scipio brothers both fell in battle due to a reckless advance while dividing their forces, which temporarily created a strategic breathing space for Carthage in Iberia. However, Rome quickly dispatched the young Scipio, only 25 years old at the time, and later known as Scipio Africanus, to take command of the Spanish theater. In 209 BC, Scipio launched a surprise attack and captured New Carthage, seizing Carthage's primary military base in Iberia and a significant portion of its silver mining revenue. Although Hasdrubal was not completely annihilated in the Battle of Baecula, he clearly recognized that the situation in Iberia was deteriorating irreversibly. In late 208 BC or early 207 BC, Hasdrubal made a significant decision to abandon Iberia and lead his main forces across the Alps into Italy to join his brother. The strategic logic of this plan was clear and bold. If the two Barcid armies could converge in central Italy, they would regain a numerical advantage sufficient to engage Rome in a large-scale battle, potentially replicating a decisive victory akin to Cannae. Hasdrubal's route largely followed the path Hannibal had taken 11 years earlier, but his crossing of the Alps was far smoother than his brother's. This was partly because the Gallic tribes along the way were already familiar with the passage of Carthaginian armies, and partly because Hasdrubal likely chose more accessible mountain passes. According to Polybius, he arrived in the Po Valley with his forces largely intact and successfully recruited a large number of Gallic warriors in northern Italy, bringing his total strength to around 30,000 men. However, Hasdrubal faced a problem that Hannibal had not encountered. This time, the Romans had ample warning and a mature response system. 11 years of war had completely transformed Rome's military machine. The Senate deployed multiple legions across the Italian peninsula, establishing a tiered defensive network from north to south. When news of Hasdrubal crossing the Alps reached Rome, the Senate acted swiftly. Consul Marcus Livius Salinator led his forces north to intercept Hasdrubal, while the other consul, Gaius Claudius Nero, continued to monitor Hannibal in the south. The key to this dual-line defense strategy was maintaining open communication between the two consuls, a need perfectly met by the road system and colonial network Rome had developed in Italy over decades. The decisive turning point came from an intercepted intelligence. Hasdrubal dispatched messengers carrying a secret letter southward, attempting to coordinate a rendezvous location and time with Hannibal. However, these messengers were intercepted while crossing Roman-controlled territory, and the secret letter fell into the hands of Consul Nero. Through this, Nero learned of Hasdrubal's marching route and approximate troop strength. He then made the boldest tactical decision of the entire war on the Roman side, leaving part of his forces in the camp to maintain the illusion of monitoring Hannibal. He personally led an elite force of 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry northward overnight, marching at a forced pace to the camp of his colleague Livius. The distance of this march was approximately 400 kilometers, and Nero's troops completed it in 6 to 7 days. Along the way, Italian towns spontaneously provided food and water, a detail that itself demonstrated the extent of recovery of the Roman alliance system after the shock of Cannae. In the 20th of June 7 BC, two Roman armies secretly converged by the Metaurus River. According to Livy, Nero's troops quietly entered Livius's camp at night without expanding the tents to avoid detection by enemy scouts of any change in troop numbers. However, Hasdrubal was an experienced commander. He noticed that the bugle calls from the opposing camp seemed to include one more set than the previous day. In the Roman military system, commanders at the consular level had specific bugle signals. This detail made him realize that he might be facing not one but two consular armies. Hasdrubal ordered a retreat at night, attempting to cross the Metaurus River and move northward. But the local guides fled in the darkness, leaving his troops disoriented and disorganized near the riverbank. At dawn, the Roman army caught up with him. The specific details of the Battle of the Metaurus vary in ancient historical records, but the general outline can be reconstructed. Hasdrubal deployed his newly recruited Gauls on the left flank, while he himself led the veteran Iberian and Libyan troops to hold a high ground on the right flank. In the early stages of the battle, his right wing, leveraging the terrain advantage, managed to withstand the frontal assault of the Romans. However, the reinforcements led by Nero bypassed the battlefield and encircled the Carthaginian army's left flank from the side and rear. The poorly trained Gallic warriors quickly collapsed, and panic spread throughout the entire army upon seeing that defeat was inevitable. Hasdrubal is said to have charged on horseback into the Roman ranks and died in battle. This outcome stands in stark contrast to his brother's later decision to retreat and seek survival after the defeat at Zama, perhaps reflecting the differences in the brothers' personalities. Or it may simply have been different choices under different battlefield conditions. We cannot truly know a person's state of mind in desperate circumstances. The casualty figures for the Battle of the Metaurus vary widely across different historical sources. Livy claims that the Carthaginian side suffered approximately 56,000 deaths, while Polybius provides a much more conservative estimate of around 10,000, considering that Hasdrubal's total forces likely numbered around 30,000. Livius' figure is almost certainly exaggerated. However, regardless of the specific casualties, the strategic consequences of the battle are indisputable. The last organized Carthaginian reinforcements on the Italian front were completely annihilated, and Hannibal's overland connection to his homeland was permanently severed. Roman losses were relatively minor, and after the battle, Nero led his troops back to the southern camp with the same astonishing speed. It is said that Hannibal only learned of what had happened in the north when the Romans threw Hasdrubal's head into his camp. From 207 BC to 203 BC, when Hannibal was recalled to North Africa, he held out for another 4 full years in the Bruttium region at the southern tip of Italy. These 4 years were the most silent chapter of the entire war. There were no large-scale battles, no dramatic tactical masterpieces, only a dwindling army maintaining its presence in an ever-shrinking territory. Hannibal's allied states were reclaimed by Rome one after another or surrendered voluntarily. His troop reinforcements relied almost entirely on local mountain people in Bruttium and small groups of Carthaginian forces smuggled in by sea. The veterans who had followed him across the Alps, the survivors of the Libyan heavy infantry and Numidian cavalry, were now weary from over a decade of campaigning. Far from home and with no return in sight, they still maintained astonishing discipline and combat effectiveness. The loyalty of these nameless soldiers is perhaps the most compelling evidence of Hannibal's leadership, speaking more powerfully than any glorious victory. Meanwhile, the focus of the war had irreversibly shifted to other battlefields in Iberia. Scipio the Younger decisively defeated the Carthaginian garrison at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC, bringing the entire peninsula under Roman influence. In Sicily and Sardinia, Rome's naval control had never truly wavered. The most critical change, however, occurred in Scipio's strategic vision. He was no longer content with defending Italy or clearing out Carthaginian forces in Iberia. Instead, he proposed taking the war directly to Carthage's homeland in North Africa. This plan faced strong opposition from the Fabian faction within the Roman Senate. Old Fabius believed that launching an expedition to North Africa while Hannibal remained in Italy was too risky. Nevertheless, Scipio ultimately secured limited authorization and forces, crossing the sea to land in North Africa in 204 BC. From that moment on, Hannibal's presence in Italy was reduced from a strategic threat to a bypassed piece on the board. Looking back at the period from 211 to 207 BC, a deeper historical question emerges. Where did Hannibal's Italian campaign ultimately fail? It was not due to a single battle. The Battle of the Metataurus eliminated Hasdrubal, not Hannibal himself. Nor was it the result of a tactical error. Hannibal made almost no military mistakes worth criticizing during those years. It failed because of an asymmetry, a military system reliant on individual genius and the combat effectiveness of an expeditionary force, pitted against an imperial system built on institutional depth, citizen mobilization, and a network of alliances. Rome could endure catastrophic losses like Cannae and continue to recruit soldiers and fight on, while Carthage was unable to provide sustained strategic supplies for Hannibal, who was far away in Italy. This was not a matter of individual capability, but a fundamental difference in how the two civilizations organized warfare. When recounting Hannibal's story, perhaps the most compelling question is not why he did not win, but how he managed to hold out for so long under such structural disadvantages. The answer to this question would soon face its final test as he was recalled to North Africa and marched toward the battlefield of Zama. On a certain morning in 204 BC, the masts of the Roman fleet appeared along the North African coastline. Hundreds of transport ships carrying 2 legions of troops sailed toward the beaches near Utica, their bows cutting through the waves that shattered into white foam under the sunlight. Standing on the deck of the flagship was Publius Cornelius Scipio, a 31-year-old former commander of the Spanish forces. His landing point was less than 30 kilometers from the city of Carthage. This was not a tentative raid. It was a blade pressed directly against Carthage's throat. For 16 years, Hannibal had spread the flames of war across the Italian peninsula, and the Romans had bled on their own soil. Now, Scipio was about to make the Carthaginians taste the same bitterness. The roles of hunter and prey were undergoing a long overdue reversal. Scipio did not arrive in North Africa out of thin air. His strategic vision underwent fierce debate in the Roman Senate. According to Livy, Fabius Maximus openly opposed the expedition plan in the Senate, arguing that dividing forces to cross the sea while Hannibal still occupied southern Italy was a risky move. Fabius's logic was not without merit. Rome's previous military campaign in Africa, the disastrous failure of Regulus's expedition in 255 BC, remained a lingering shadow in the minds of the senators. However, Scipio's supporters pointed out a crucial strategic reality. Hannibal in Italy had been confined to the Bruttium Peninsula, unable to receive effective reinforcements from Carthage itself or further destabilize Rome's alliance system. Rather than engaging in endless skirmishes with a defensive master in the mountains of southern Italy, it was better to move the battlefield to the enemy's doorstep, forcing Carthage to recall its most dangerous general. This logic ultimately persuaded enough senators. Scipio was granted command over Sicily and permission to cross the sea. But the Senate deliberately withheld additional, regular legions. He had to rely on volunteers and survivors of the Battle of Cannae to assemble his expeditionary force. The soldiers stripped of their honors and exiled to serve in Sicily after Cannae formed the backbone of this army. They had a blood debt to settle. Scipio's first move in North Africa was not to besiege cities, but to engage in diplomacy. His target was Numidia. In this vast land west of Carthage, two princes were vying for the throne, Massinissa and Syphax. The combat prowess of the Numidian cavalry was renowned throughout the Mediterranean world. It was this very cavalry that executed the devastating encirclement of the Roman horsemen at the Battle of Cannae. Whoever could secure the Numidian cavalry would hold a key advantage in the next decisive battle. Scipio had already established contact with Massinissa during his campaigns in Spain. This young Numidian prince had once fought on the side of Carthage, but after witnessing Scipio's military genius on the Iberian battlefield, he gradually shifted toward a pro-Roman stance. Syphax, on the other hand, had initially engaged with Rome but ultimately aligned himself with Carthage. After marrying Sophonisba, a Carthaginian noblewoman, the power dynamics in North Africa thus took on a delicate symmetry. Carthage had won over Syphax, while Rome placed its bets on Massinissa. The struggle for control of these cavalry resources would prove decisive in every battle that followed. In the spring of 203 BC, Scipio launched a night raid on the camp of the allied forces of Syphax and Carthage. According to Polybius, the Romans used peace negotiations as a cover, repeatedly sending envoys into the enemy camp to scout its layout. Among the envoys' attendants were disguised centurions. When the night attack began, Roman soldiers first set fire to the simple reed and wood huts in Syphax's camp. The flames spread rapidly in the dry North African night wind. The Carthaginian allies awakened from their sleep and, mistaking the fire for an accident, rushed out of their tents without armor, only to encounter the Roman infantry waiting in formation. According to Polybius' figures, the Allied forces lost nearly 40,000 men that night, most of whom died in the fire and ensuing stampede rather than by the sword. This number may be exaggerated, but the outcome of the night raid was certain. Syphax's military strength was dealt a devastating blow, and a huge gap was torn in Carthage's defensive system in North Africa. With a single fire, Scipio achieved a strategic effect that might otherwise have required months of siege. The Carthaginian Senate was thrown into a panic. The remnants of Syphax's forces attempted to regroup, but were once again crushed by Scipio on the plains of the Bagradas River. Massinissa's cavalry pursued Syphax himself all the way to his royal capital, Cirta, capturing the king and delivering him to the Roman camp. Carthage had lost its most important North African ally. Within the city, the peace faction began to gain the upper hand, and the Senate dispatched envoys to Scipio to request a ceasefire. The two sides reached a provisional truce agreement, the terms of which included Carthage withdrawing all garrisons from Italy and Iberia, surrendering most of its warships, and paying reparations. However, the fate of this agreement depended on one man who had not yet returned. While signing the truce, the Carthaginian Senate issued a recall order to Hannibal. The man who, 16 years earlier, had crossed the Alps with nearly 100,000 troops, now had to return with the last remaining force he had in Italy to defend a city he had scarcely ever truly lived in. We must pause here to examine a methodological issue. Our detailed accounts of Scipio's North African campaign rely almost entirely on two historians, Polybius and Livy. Polybius had close personal ties to the Scipio family. He was the mentor and close friend of Scipio Aemilianus and held evident admiration for the military prowess of Scipio Africanus. Livy, building upon Polybius, further added dramatic details. This means that the narrative of the North African campaign we read is to a considerable extent a story told from the Scipio perspective. The strategic considerations, internal debates, and assessments of the war situation on the Carthaginian side have left almost no first-hand records. We are not even certain of the exact timing and specific motives behind the Carthaginian Senate's recall of Hannibal. Was it purely military panic, or did the peace faction seize the opportunity to weaken the Barcid family's independent military power abroad? In the surviving historical sources, we can only see the speculations of the Roman side. When we recount the Battle of Zama, we must always remain aware that we are viewing a decisive battle through the eyes of the victors, while the defeated have no opportunity to defend themselves. In the autumn of 203 BC, Hannibal boarded a ship at the port of Croton, in southern Italy. According to Livy, as he left the Italian coast, he looked back at the land and cursed fate, and those who had prevented him from achieving final victory. Though this account bears clear literary embellishment, and its authenticity cannot be confirmed, what is certain is that Hannibal took with him his last remaining veterans in Italy, numbering between 15 and 20,000. Among these soldiers were the remnants of the Libyan veterans who had crossed the Alps with him, Brucians and Lucanians recruited in Italy, as well as deserters and adventurers from various ethnic groups gathered over years of campaigning. They were an experienced but exhausted army, having been away from their homeland for too long and largely unfamiliar with the terrain and political environment of Carthage itself. After landing at Hadrumetum, Hannibal did not immediately head to the city of Carthage, but instead stationed himself in the coastal region, beginning to recruit and train local new troops. He needed time to integrate these forces of varying quality into a cohesive army capable of engaging in battle. But time was precisely what he lacked most. After Hannibal returned to North Africa, the temporary truce agreement had already become a dead letter. According to Polybius, Carthage adopted a tougher stance following Hannibal's return, seizing a Roman supply fleet that had drifted into the port of Carthage due to a storm. An act Rome viewed as a blatant violation of the agreement. Some scholars also argue that the truce was merely a delaying tactic from the outset, allowing Carthage to buy time while awaiting Hannibal's return. Regardless of the reason, the war reignited. Scipio led his forces deep into Carthaginian territory, systematically destroying farms and granaries in the Bagradas River Valley, thereby cutting off the food supply lines to the city of Carthage. This strategy forced Hannibal to actively seek a decisive battle. He could not afford to watch his rear being gradually eroded. According to Livy, Hannibal sent an envoy to Scipio before the final battle, proposing a meeting. The two commanders engaged in a two-phase negotiation near the battlefield. Hannibal offered peace on the condition that Carthage abandon all its overseas territories. But Scipio refused. His demands were even harsher than those of the previous truce agreement. Whether this meeting actually took place remains a subject of debate among historians. However, the narrative significance it conveys is clear. The two most brilliant military minds of their time stood face to face at a moment that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean and the failure of the negotiations meant that everything would be decided on the battlefield. In the 20th of October 2 BC, the two armies arrayed themselves on the plains near Zama. The exact location of the battlefield remains uncertain, as ancient historical accounts provide inconsistent descriptions, and modern archaeology has yet to offer a definitive conclusion. Zama is more of a conventional name, with some scholars favoring a location closer to Naragara. However, the basic disposition of the battle is clear. Hannibal commanded between 36,000 and 50,000 infantry and 2,000 to 4,000 cavalry, including his seasoned veterans brought back from Italy, newly recruited citizen, soldiers from Carthage itself, as well as Macedonian mercenaries and Ligurians. He also possessed 80 war elephants, the last that Carthage could muster in North Africa. Scipio's forces consisted of approximately 29,000 to 34,000 infantry, but he held an overwhelming advantage in cavalry. Massinissa brought around 6,000 to 9,000 Numidian cavalry and several thousand infantry. The balance of cavalry power had completely reversed. At Cannae, Hannibal had achieved a double envelopment thanks to his superior cavalry. At Zama, he would face the same disadvantage. The hunter's weapon was now in the hands of the hunted. Hannibal's deployment demonstrated his acute awareness of his own weaknesses. He arranged his army in 3 horizontal lines, maintaining considerable distance between each. The first line consisted of Carthaginian mercenaries, Ligurians, Gauls, Balearic slingers, and Moors troops of varying combat effectiveness, whom Hannibal placed at the forefront to absorb the initial impact. The second line was composed of Carthaginian citizen, soldiers and Libyan recruits, who lacked practical experience but were substantial in number. The third line, Hannibal's true trump card, was his seasoned veterans brought back from Italy, men who had followed him for over a decade and were the most experienced infantry in the entire Mediterranean world. Hannibal's likely intention was to have the first 2 lines exhaust the Roman infantry's stamina and disrupt their formation, then launch a decisive strike with the fresh troops of the third line. War elephants were positioned at the very front of the entire army, tasked with breaking the Roman lines at the onset of battle. This was a defensive counterattack strategy. Hannibal knew he could not match his opponent in cavalry, so his infantry had to secure an advantage on the central front before the cavalry engagement was decided. Scipio's response demonstrated a profound understanding of Hannibal's tactical system. Facing the charge of war elephants, he abandoned the traditional dense formation and instead left vertical channels between the infantry squares. As the elephants charged, Roman soldiers moved aside, using horns and shouts, to drive the frightened beasts along the channels through their lines, directing them toward the open ground behind rather than trampling their own infantry. According to Polybius, some elephants, startled by the blaring horns, turned back and charged into the Carthaginian left flank, disrupting Hannibal's own cavalry formations. Seizing this chaos, Massinissa led the Numidian cavalry in a fierce assault on the Carthaginian left wing. Simultaneously, the Roman right-wing cavalry pressed the Carthaginian right flank. The outcome of the cavalry battle on both wings quickly became clear. The Carthaginian cavalry was routed and driven from the field. This scene bore a striking resemblance to Cannae, only with the roles of attacker and defender completely reversed. However, the cavalry pursuit also meant that Massinissa's horsemen were temporarily absent from the battlefield. The outcome of the central infantry clash would be decided before the cavalry returned. The infantry clash on the central front was exceptionally brutal. The Roman front line of Hastati engaged the Carthaginian mercenaries in close combat, with both sides repeatedly pushing and shoving at close range, using short swords and shields. The mercenaries' resistance proved more tenacious than expected, but as they began to retreat, they discovered that the second line of Carthaginian citizen soldiers did not advance to support them. According to Polybius, The second line refused to move forward out of fear and even used their weapons to prevent the retreating mercenaries from passing through their ranks. This led to a chaotic internal conflict. The mercenaries, feeling they had been abandoned, turned to attack the Carthaginian citizen. Soldiers behind them. Scipio's first line seized the opportunity to reorganize, then joined forces with the second line of Principes to crush the mixed remnants of Carthage's first two lines. A brief lull momentarily settled over the battlefield. The ground between the two armies was littered with corpses and wounded soldiers, and the Roman infantry needed to regroup to face Hannibal's still uncommitted third line of veterans. Scipio made a crucial decision. Instead of sending the exhausted first line into another charge, he pulled the Hastati back to the center and extended the Principes and Triarii to the flanks, forming a single battle line as wide as Hannibal's third line. This was a textbook battlefield reorganization, and executing it under the chaotic conditions of actual combat required exceptional troop discipline and command, and control capabilities. When the reorganized Roman line clashed head-on with Hannibal's Italian veterans, the battle entered its most brutal phase. These veterans were Hannibal's last elite troops, having survived the battles of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, and they were intimately familiar with Roman legionary tactics. The two sides engaged in a straightforward pushing match on the plain. Devoid of fancy maneuvers, relying purely on willpower and physical strength. According to Polybius, the lines seesawed back and forth, with neither side able to overpower the other. Hannibal's veterans were not superior in numbers, but their experience and cohesion allowed them to maintain their formation under immense pressure. If the battle had been solely infantry against infantry, the outcome might have been different. But Massinissa's cavalry returned. The Numidian and Roman cavalry, which had pursued the Carthaginian horsemen, returned to the battlefield at the critical moment and charged from behind the Carthaginian third line. Hannibal's veterans found themselves trapped in a hopeless pincer, facing relentless pressure from the Roman infantry in front and a fierce cavalry assault from behind. This was a mirror image of the Battle of Cannae. At Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry encircled the Roman legions from the rear. At Zama, the same fate befell his own soldiers. The veterans' resistance gradually crumbled, their line collapsing from the rear before turning into a full-scale rout. According to Polybius, the Carthaginian army lost around 20,000 men killed and nearly 20,000 captured in this phase, while Roman casualties were approximately 1,500, a figure that may be underestimated. But the disparity in losses is largely credible. Hannibal himself fled the battlefield with a few attendants, first retreating to Hadrumetum and then returning to Carthage. His 16-year undefeated record in Italy was ended in his first large-scale pitched battle on African soil. The outcome of the Battle of Zama must be understood on both tactical and strategic levels. Tactically, Scipio achieved a textbook victory, but its core element was not some stroke of genius. Rather, it was the systematic application of cavalry superiority. Massinissa's defection was the decisive factor. Without the Numidian cavalry, Scipio's infantry might not have been able to break Hannibal's veterans' head-on. This point deserves emphasis, as later narratives often portray Zama as a battle of wits between two brilliant commanders, overlooking the fact that political and diplomatic efforts off the battlefield were equally crucial to the outcome. Scipio's efforts to win over Massinissa had begun years earlier, and this long-term strategic investment paid off on the day of the decisive battle, translating into overwhelming cavalry dominance. Strategically, Zama completely shattered Carthage's ability and will to continue the war. Carthage was forced to accept extremely harsh terms, surrendering all war elephants and nearly its entire fleet, paying an enormous indemnity of 10,000 talents, and being forbidden from declaring war without Rome's permission. A once dominant maritime empire that controlled the western Mediterranean, was thus reduced to a Roman vassal. The Second Punic War ended with Rome's total victory. However, we must pause the narrative's momentum here to examine the sources of information we rely upon. Nearly all details of the Battle of Zama come from Polybius and Livy, both of whom wrote from a Roman perspective. Polybius had close personal ties to the Scipio family. He was the mentor and close friend of Scipio Aemilianus. And whether this relationship influenced his account of Scipio Africanus's achievements has long been debated among historians. No written records from the Carthaginian side regarding this battle have survived, or if they ever existed, they were lost forever with the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. We cannot even determine the exact location of the battlefield known as Zama. Modern archaeology has proposed at least 3 possible sites, with no consensus reached to this day. This means our understanding of the battle, from troop numbers to tactical details, has been filtered through the victor's narrative. It is an undisputed fact that Hannibal was defeated at Zama. However, the specifics of how he was defeated, the true casualty ratios on both sides, and whether Hannibal truly made tactical errors, the answers to these questions are far less certain than traditional narratives suggest. For Hannibal, Zama was not an end, but a turning point of identity. After his defeat, he returned to Carthage and unexpectedly entered the political arena. According to Livy, Hannibal was elected as the suffete of Carthage after the war, a chief magistrate similar to a consul. He implemented a series of financial reforms, investigating the embezzlement of public funds by the oligarchic nobility and restructuring the tax system, enabling Carthage to pay war reparations to Rome on time without crushing the common people. This political career revealed another side of Hannibal, often overshadowed by his military legend. He was not only a battlefield commander, but also a political figure with administrative ability and a willingness to reform. However, his reforms threatened the foundations of the vested interests within Carthage, and these oligarchic nobles reported to the Roman Senate that Hannibal was secretly planning a new war. Rome sent envoys demanding Carthage hand over Hannibal. It is reasonable to speculate that Hannibal was not surprised by this outcome. He had already left Carthage before the Roman envoys arrived, embarking on a long period of exile in 195 BC. The general who had terrified Rome for 16 years became an exile without an army or a country. From the battlefield of Zama to the council halls of Carthage, and on to the path of exile that lay ahead. The trajectory of Hannibal's life sketches a historical figure far more complex than that of a great general. His defeat at Zama was less a reflection of his personal shortcomings, and more the ultimate manifestation of Carthage's systemic exhaustion of resources over the course of a prolonged war. A commander may win battles, but he cannot win a war single-handedly. The outcome of war ultimately hinges on a nation's mobilization capacity, the stability of its alliance systems, and sustained logistical support, areas in which Carthage consistently fell short compared to Rome throughout the conflict. The Mediterranean world entered a new phase after Zama. Rome was no longer merely the hegemon of the Italian peninsula, but began projecting its power across the entire Mediterranean. The decline of Carthage, the weakening of Macedon, and the contraction of the Seleucid Empire would all unfold over the next half-century. As for Hannibal, a man who had lost his homeland, he would wander among the courts of the East, striving to use his remaining wisdom and prestige to seek some possibility of resistance against an irreversible historical tide. Around 200 BC at the port of Carthage, a merchant ship slowly docked. On its deck stood a man nearing 50 years of age. His left eye was said to have been severely damaged during a march through the marshes of Italy, and 16 years of war had etched deeper marks upon him than time itself. Hannibal Barca had returned to the city he had left as a youth. The city walls still stood tall, and its twin harbors remained bustling. But it was no longer a Mediterranean power. The treaty, signed after the defeat at Zama, had stripped Carthage of all its overseas territories, nearly all its warships, and burdened it with a staggering indemnity of 10,000 talents to be paid in installments over 50 years. The bustle of the port was an illusion, or perhaps a lingering habit. The true balance of power had been rewritten. The moment Hannibal stepped onto the dock, he was not met by crowds welcoming a hero's return, but by a political wasteland carved up anew by oligarchic families. He had fought for 15 years in Italy, while Carthage's senators had waged another war during those same 15 years. A struggle over who would define the responsibility for defeat and who would divide what remained of the spoils. The internal political situation of Carthage after the war is primarily pieced together from the accounts of Livy and Appian, as most of Polybius's relevant volumes have been lost. This means our understanding of Hannibal's political activities after his return is almost entirely refracted through the prism of a Roman perspective. In Livy's portrayal, Hannibal during this period is depicted with an almost contradictory image, both a dangerous avenger and a powerless failure. This dual characterization serves the needs of the Roman narrative. Hannibal must be dangerous enough to justify Rome's continued pressure, yet isolated enough to demonstrate the irresistibility of Roman order. When reading the subsequent narrative of reforms, it is essential to remain aware of this filter. Carthage's own administrative archives and records of Senate debates were completely lost with the destruction of the city in 146 BC. What we hear is the voice of the defeated recounted by the victors. According to Livy, Hannibal was elected as a suffete of Carthage in 196 BC, a position roughly equivalent to the highest executive official, with a one-year term. A man who once commanded tens of thousands of troops now had to push for change through votes and decrees within an oligarchic system dominated by the Council of 100 and the Senate. The first problem he faced was extremely specific. Money, the indemnity stipulated by the Treaty of Zama, was staggering, and Carthage's financial system had been severely eroded during the war by the corruption of the oligarchic families. According to Appian, Hannibal discovered that a large portion of public tax revenue was being intercepted by intermediaries, with enough wealth flowing into private pockets to pay off the Roman indemnity without raising taxes. This discovery pushed him into direct conflict with the city's powerful elite. He was not fighting against Rome, but against Carthage's own vested interests. Based on the available historical records, the reforms implemented by Hannibal encompassed at least two aspects. The first was fiscal transparency. He demanded public audits of state revenues and expenditures, investigating specific points of tax leakage. The second involved institutional adjustments. He promoted legislation to limit the re-election of judges in the 100 Council, transforming what had been lifelong positions with unlimited re-election into one-year terms without the possibility of reappointment. This reform directly targeted the core mechanism through which oligarchic families maintained their interests by long-term control of judicial power. Within just a few months, Hannibal transformed from a returning general into the most controversial figure in Carthaginian domestic politics. His supporters were middle and lower class merchants and ordinary citizens, while his opponents were the families who had profited from embezzling public funds during the war years. Perhaps he genuinely believed that a fiscally healthy Carthage could rise again. Or perhaps he merely used reform as a tool to consolidate his personal power base. These two motives are not mutually exclusive, and the historical records at our disposal are insufficient to determine which one predominated. The depth of interests shaken by the reforms can be inferred from the intensity of the opposition's reaction. According to Livy, after failing to stop Hannibal through internal political means, the Carthaginian oligarchs chose a path that was not uncommon but extremely deadly in ancient Mediterranean politics. In forming an external power, they sent envoys to the Roman Senate, accusing Hannibal of secretly contacting King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire to plan a new war against Rome. Was this accusation true? From subsequent developments, Hannibal did eventually seek refuge in Antiochus's court. But whether this was a long premeditated strategic move, or the only option left when he was cornered, remains unclear from historical records. What is certain is that the Roman Senate responded swiftly and decisively to the accusation. They dispatched a delegation to Carthage, ostensibly to discuss border disputes, but with the actual target being Hannibal himself. A man who had never been defeated by Rome on the battlefield was about to be ensnared by a political pincer movement. In 195 BC, Hannibal left Carthage. Regarding the manner of his departure, Livy provides a dramatic account upon learning the true intentions of the Roman delegation. Hannibal rode out of the city that very night, hurried to the coast, boarded a ship that had been prepared in advance, and sailed eastward. Whether this narrative has been embellished with literary flair is impossible to verify, but the core facts are likely credible. His departure was hasty, forced, and not a deliberate strategic retreat. Carthage did not defend him. The senators who had cheered his victories after Cannae, the politicians who had refused to send reinforcements while he was trapped in southern Italy, were now content to see this troublemaker disappear. For the Carthaginian oligarchs, Hannibal's exile was the resolution of a problem, not the loss of a hero. Hannibal's first stop in exile was the court of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus III was at the peak of his power at the time, with his empire stretching from Asia Minor to the fringes of Central Asia. He styled himself as the Great King, and was vying with Rome for influence over the Greek world. For Antiochus, the arrival of a renowned general, who had once defeated Roman legions, was both a propaganda asset and a potential source of trouble. According to Livy, Hannibal proposed a bold strategic plan to Antiochus. He would lead a fleet back to the western Mediterranean to open a second front in Italy or North Africa, while Antiochus advanced into Greece from the east, creating a pincer attack on Rome. This plan was not without strategic logic, but it required one crucial precondition. Antiochus had to trust Hannibal and be willing to entrust a significant independent force to the command of a foreign exile. This precondition was never met. Antiochus's attitude toward Hannibal likely involved more exploitation than trust from the very beginning. An exiled Carthaginian general, no matter how illustrious his reputation, held no foundation within the power structure of the Seleucid court. He had no army, no territory, no resources to mobilize. His only assets were experience and fame, the latter being a double-edged sword in court politics. According to Appian, Antiochus's courtiers were wary of Hannibal, fearing that this outsider might overshadow them if given military command. A widely circulated anecdote tells of Antiochus showing Hannibal his splendidly equipped army and asking, "Will this be enough for the Romans?" Hannibal coldly replied, "Yes, enough even for the greediest of Romans," implying that the army was all show and fit only to be spoils of war. The authenticity of this anecdote is doubtful. It seems more like a bitter footnote added by later authors to Hannibal's years in exile. Yet, it accurately captures a structural dilemma. A military genius without a power base can only serve as a pawn on someone else's chessboard. In 190 BC, Antiochus was decisively defeated by the Roman army at the Battle of Magnesia. The details of this battle need not be elaborated here. What matters are its consequences. The Seleucid Empire was forced to sign the Treaty of Apamea, ceding most of its territories in Asia Minor, paying a massive indemnity and surrendering its war elephants and fleet. Among the treaty's terms was one directly concerning Hannibal. Rome demanded that Antiochus hand him over. Whether Antiochus truly intended to enforce this clause is unclear in historical records. But Hannibal did not wait for an answer. He fled once again. From this moment on, his exile was downgraded from that of a court advisor in a great empire to that of a political refugee, drifting between the minor states on the fringes of Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean. Hannibal's whereabouts thereafter are sparsely and contradictorily recorded in historical sources. According to some accounts, he briefly stayed in Crete before moving to Armenia, with some even claiming that he planned a new city, Artaxata, for the Armenian king, Artaxias. This claim, primarily found in Plutarch's writings, is debated among scholars for its reliability, as Plutarch wrote nearly 3 centuries after the events and tended to embellish the legends of famous figures. Regardless of the accuracy of these details, they collectively paint a poignant picture. A commander who once made the Roman Republic tremble now wandered from court to court in peripheral kingdoms, trading his military expertise for temporary refuge. Each move marked a further decline in his status, with each new patron weaker and less capable of resisting Roman pressure than the last. Hannibal's final refuge was the Kingdom of Bithynia, a small state in northwestern Asia Minor, wedged between the Roman sphere of influence and the surrounding Hellenistic kingdoms. King Prusias I took him in, and according to accounts by Justin and Cornelius Nepos, allegedly followed Hannibal's advice in a naval battle against the neighboring kingdom of Pergamon by hurling clay pots filled with venomous snakes onto enemy ships. This detail, clearly colored by anecdotal literature, reflects a genuine reality. The scope of Hannibal's influence in Bithynia had shrunk from commanding tens of thousands in major battles to offering tactical advice for a localized maritime conflict. The genius remained, but the stage had diminished to the point of barely accommodating him. Rome's pursuit of Hannibal never ceased. This fact alone is worth pondering. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the Battle of Zama. Carthage had long been disarmed, and Hannibal himself commanded not a single soldier. His actual military threat to Rome was 0. Yet, the Roman Senate continued to pressure every kingdom that harbored him to hand him over. This persistence went beyond rational security calculations. Perhaps this is the essence of what later generations called the Hannibal fear. It was not a response to a specific military threat, but a collective traumatic memory that had become ingrained in political culture. The shadow of Cannae was too deep, as long as a man who had once stood at the gates of Rome remained alive. He was a living refutation of Rome's myth of invincibility. Eliminating him was not about removing danger, but about completing the closure of a narrative. In 183 BC, the same year, another old enemy of Rome, Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal, also died in political disappointment, a coincidence repeatedly mentioned by later historians. Roman envoy Flaminius arrived in Bithynia, pressuring Prusias to hand over Hannibal. Prusias yielded, according to Cornelius Nepos, when Hannibal discovered that all exits of his residence were blocked by Bithynian soldiers. He knew his final hour had come. He retrieved the poison he had carried for many years. It was said he had hidden it in a ring since the beginning of his exile. Different historical sources offer varying accounts of whether he spoke any last words. Nepos records the version. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they lack the patience to wait for an old man to die naturally. Livy's version is slightly different in wording, but consistent in its core meaning. Whether these final words are authentic cannot be confirmed, but the very fact that they have been preserved indicates something. Even Roman historians could not entirely erase a certain respect for this adversary. Hannibal died at around 64 years old. From the age of 9, when he left Carthage with his father for Iberia, he spent 55 years in foreign lands. 15 of those years were spent fighting in Italy, and nearly 20 in exile in the east. The time he truly lived in Carthage during his life was no more than 7 or 8 years. This number itself forms a cruel symmetry, the city he fought for. He almost never truly resided in, and the place where he ultimately died had no connection to anything he held dear. A man who was never defeated on the battlefield in his lifetime died in the hunt of politics. This statement may sound like rhetoric, but it accurately describes the facts. From the Taunus River to Cannae, from Lake Trasimene to Zama, no Roman general ever truly destroyed Hannibal's military capabilities in direct confrontation. The defeat at Zama was more due to the disparity in troop quality and the defection of the Numidian cavalry than to errors in command. What killed him was the political betrayal within Carthage, the relentless pressure of Rome's diplomatic machinery, and the structural forces that every protector he encountered during his exile ultimately proved powerless to resist. However, reducing Hannibal's fate to the narrative template of a tragic hero is also a simplification that warrants caution. Were his reforms in Carthage truly for the public good? Or did they also serve to consolidate his personal power? Had his proposed two-front strategy at the Seleucid court been implemented? Would it have brought the scourge of war to even more regions? His military campaigns throughout his life resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Italian farmers, Gallic tribesmen, North African soldiers, and Iberian townspeople, whose fates are scarcely mentioned in heroic narratives. Evaluating Hannibal solely as a brilliant general betrayed by fate obscures the true cost of war and the ordinary lives caught in the chess games of great figures. The complexity of history demands that we hold both reverence and skepticism, rather than making an either or choice between the two. When news of Hannibal's death reached Rome, the Senate held no public celebrations. At least, none are recorded in surviving historical documents. This silence speaks louder than any festival could have. The name that had kept 3 generations of Romans awake at night was finally gone. But the fear was dispelled not with triumphant cheers, but with a quiet sigh of relief. Hannibal's physical body died in an unnoticed room in Bithynia, yet his life as a symbol was only beginning its longest chapter. In later Roman literature, he would be written about again and again, sometimes as the embodiment of barbarism, sometimes as a worthy adversary, and sometimes as a moral yardstick to chastise Rome's own decline. Cicero quoted him, Livy shaped him, Juvenal mocked him. Every era of Rome needed a Hannibal. Just as every civilization's narrative requires a powerful opposite to define itself. His story never truly ended because it was never his alone. The narrative of this chapter relies almost entirely on the Greco-Roman literary corpus, Nepos, Livy, Appian, and Plutarch. Without exception, these authors wrote about Hannibal's later years from the perspective of Roman victors or Greek observers. We have no writings from Hannibal himself, no Carthaginian records of his years in exile, and no direct descriptions of him from the court archives of the Seleucid or Bithynian kingdoms. This means that everything we know, his motives for reform, his state of mind during exile, his final words, has been filtered and reshaped through the lens of others. The composed Hannibal facing death, as portrayed by Nepos, may indeed be close to reality. But it is equally possible that it reflects the literary trope of the great man's death within the Hellenistic biographical tradition. What we can do is use these sources while always remaining aware of their limitations. In 183 BC, 2 eras of the Mediterranean world came to an end in the same year. Hannibal died in Bithynia, and Scipio passed away in self-imposed exile at Liternum. One was a fugitive hunted to his death, the other, a victor driven out by political trials. Both endings pointed to the same truth. The political machinery of the Roman Republic left no permanent place for any individual. Defeating Hannibal did not spare Scipio from suspicion, just as military genius did not save Hannibal from isolation. In the next chapter, we will begin with the disappearance of these two men to examine the world they left behind. Carthage would survive for another 37 years without Hannibal, until it was completely razed in 146 BC. And Rome, after eliminating all external threats, would turn the violent energy forged in war inward upon itself. Hannibal's story had ended, but the questions he revealed, the relationship between genius and institutions, the cost of war and civilization, the entanglement of memory and power, were only beginning to echo through history with their deepest resonance. On a summer day in 146 BC, Carthage was burning. Roman soldiers advanced house by house, consigning 6 centuries worth of archives, ledgers, temple inscriptions, and private letters to the flames. According to Appian, the fire raged for 17 days, after which the Romans plowed the ruins and scattered salt over the land. A ritual act whose historical accuracy remains debated. Yet its intent was unmistakable. Not only to destroy a nation, but to erase its ability to speak for itself. By the time the flames consumed the libraries on the Baisa hill, Hannibal had been dead for 37 years. Yet it was this very conflagration that ensured, for the next 2 millennia, all narratives about him would pass through a filter. The surviving texts almost exclusively penned by his enemies. A general's battlefield record may be defeated, but when a civilization's collective memory is burned, even defeat loses its own storyteller. The Hannibal we can read about today is first and foremost the Hannibal depicted by Polybius. This Greek historian from Megalopolis lived in Rome as a hostage, formed a close friendship with Scipio Aemilianus, who destroyed Carthage and witnessed the fall of Carthage with his own eyes. Polybius claimed to pursue pragmatic history, emphasizing causal analysis over moral preaching. And his acknowledgement of Hannibal's military talents was indeed more candid than that of most contemporary Roman writers. However, even so, he still attributed Hannibal's core character traits to greed and cruelty, 2 labels that precisely align with the Romans' fixed prejudices against the Carthaginian national character. Polybius claimed to have consulted the works of the pro-Carthaginian Greek historians Silanus and Isosceles, who had accompanied Hannibal's army and left behind first-hand accounts. However, their original works have long been lost, and we can only glimpse their content indirectly through Polybius's citations and critiques. In other words, even the historical sources closest to a Carthaginian perspective exist only as fragments recounted by their opponents. After Polybius, the Roman historian Livy further pushed the image of Hannibal in the direction of a moral allegory. Livy wrote nearly 2 centuries after the Second Punic War, and he openly admitted that he relied heavily on earlier works rather than original archives. In his narrative, Hannibal was endowed with an almost supernatural cruelty, not only military ruthlessness, but also a racialized moral flaw, the so-called Punic faith. This phrase solidified in Latin as punica fides, literally meaning Carthaginian trustworthiness, but in practice it implied untrustworthiness. In Livy's portrayal, Hannibal was exceptionally intelligent, yet morally corrupt, extraordinarily brave, yet bloodthirsty. The function of this narrative strategy was clear. Rome needed a sufficiently formidable enemy to demonstrate the greatness of its victory, but this enemy had to be morally inferior to Rome to justify Roman hegemony. It is worth noting that Livy himself was not entirely unaware. He occasionally inserted qualifiers such as according to some historians in his narrative, suggesting that the version he adopted was not the only one. However, these qualifiers were repeatedly overlooked over 2 millennia of transmission, leaving behind only that solidified image. It is necessary here to pause the narrative and examine the very tools we are using. The main surviving historical sources on Hannibal Polybius, Livy, Appian, Plutarch are all Greek or Latin texts, all written by authors with political ties to Rome. The native Punic literature of Carthage survives only in scattered inscriptions and a few Latin translations of agricultural works, with no complete Carthaginian history having been passed down to the present day. This means that what we possess is not history, but a one-sidedly edited account of it. Modern archaeology offers some possibility for correction. Inscriptions from North Africa and Iberia, coins, and material evidence of pottery trade networks can partially reconstruct the economic vitality and cultural complexity of Carthaginian society. However, these silent material proofs cannot replace a history of the war written from the Carthaginian perspective. We must always remain aware that every detail recounted in this series, from chapter 1 to chapter 9, has been filtered through the lens of the victors. Rome's fear of Hannibal did not dissipate with his death. Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal is at the gates. This Latin proverb continued to be used by Romans to frighten disobedient children long after Carthage's fall, and by the Senate to create a sense of urgency for expansionist policies. According to Plutarch, Cato the Elder concluded every speech in the Senate with the famous phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, regardless of whether the day's topic was related to Carthage. This obsession transcended rational strategic assessment, becoming a symptom of collective psychological trauma. The memory of losing tens of thousands of citizens, soldiers in a single day at the Battle of Cannae, became deeply embedded in Rome's political and cultural DNA. It is reasonable to speculate that this intergenerational fear led Rome to choose complete annihilation over conquest. In the Third Punic War, they sought to eliminate not just a city, but a memory that made them feel vulnerable. Yet, the flip side of fear is fascination. Rome's military tradition never truly let go of Hannibal's tactical legacy. The tactic Scipio used to defeat Hannibal at Zama cavalry flanking maneuvers, layered infantry formations, precise identification of enemy weaknesses, were themselves a systematic study and adaptation of Hannibal's methods. For centuries thereafter, Roman military education repeatedly analyzed the battles of Cannae, Lake Trasimene, and Trebia, turning the enemy's victories into their own textbooks. This created a peculiar paradox. While Rome portrayed Hannibal as a moral villain in its political narrative, it revered him as the highest technical standard in military practice. The defeated enemy became an eternal teacher, an image that had to be carefully controlled, acknowledging his terror while denying him moral legitimacy. This military fascination reached new heights in modern Europe. Napoleon openly declared Hannibal one of his most admired ancient generals, and it is said that he consciously compared himself to Hannibal when crossing the Alps into Italy. In the late 19th century, Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the Prussian General Staff, distilled the Battle of Cannae into the theoretical paradigm of a double envelopment annihilation battle, and incorporated it into the core of German military doctrine. The Schlieffen Plan, the grand vision aimed at swiftly encircling the French forces on the Western Front, was conceptually born directly from an abstract understanding of Cannae. Yet, this understanding may have precisely missed Cannae's most crucial lesson. Hannibal won the battle, but failed to win the war, and a tactically perfect encirclement does not automatically translate into a strategically decisive victory. Schlieffen successors encountered the same dilemma in 1914, and the two world wars of the 20th century repeatedly demonstrated that the mechanical imitation of the Cannae model often led to catastrophic strategic miscalculations. If the European military tradition extracted a tactical model from Hannibal, modern North Africa's claim to him points to an entirely different dimension. During Tunisia's independence movement in the 20th century, Hannibal was reshaped into a pioneer of resistance against Western imperialism, a hero who set out from Africa and brought the flames of war to the heart of Europe. After independence, Tunisia emblazoned Hannibal's image on banknotes and included him in textbooks, while the ruins of Carthage became a symbolic landmark of national identity. This claim is entirely understandable emotionally, but it requires careful historical scrutiny. Ancient Carthage was a Phoenician colonial city-state, and there exists a significant historical rupture between the cultural identity of its elite and the modern Arab Berber identity of Tunisia. Incorporating Hannibal into modern national narratives is essentially a form of reverse projection, reorganizing ancient historical fragments according to contemporary political needs. This does not mean such claims are without value, but it reminds us that the struggle over Hannibal's image has never ceased. It has merely shifted from the Roman Senate to modern nation-states. In the academic realm, the postcolonial turn in the latter half of the 20th century brought profound methodological changes to Hannibal studies. Scholars began systematically questioning, to what extent do the Greco-Roman sources we rely on reflect historical facts, and to what extent do they reveal the cultural biases of their authors? Serge Lancelot's comprehensive history of Carthage, De Viger's systematic compilation of Punic inscriptions, and recent archaeological analyses of Barcid coinage on the Iberian Peninsula all seek to recover voices submerged by textual evidence through material artifacts. These efforts have yielded substantial results. For instance, Carthage's urban planning, harbor engineering, and agricultural technology far surpassed the barbaric merchant image implied by Roman historians. The Barcid rule in Iberia was not merely military plunder, but involved complex administrative development and cultural integration. However, these revisions remain fragmented. We may never reconstruct a Carthaginian version of the Second Punic War. All we can do is remain vigilant within the gaps of existing historical sources. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this dilemma is the only possible direct documentary trace left by Hannibal himself. According to Polybius, Hannibal erected a bronze tablet inscription at the Licinium Temple in southern Italy, inscribed bilingually in Punic and Greek, detailing the statistics of his forces since his departure from Iberia. Polybius claimed to have seen this inscription with his own eyes and incorporated its numbers into his narrative. If this account is true, then this bronze tablet might represent the only moment Hannibal entered the historical record in his own voice. However, the tablet itself has long since vanished. What we have is a Latinized retelling by a Greek of a Punic inscription. Even the closest evidence to the original voice has undergone multiple layers of translation and filtering. This detail itself serves as a microcosm of the entire dilemma surrounding the historical sources on Hannibal. So, after acknowledging all these limitations, what can we still say? Perhaps it is this. The reason Hannibal's story retains its power more than 2,000 years later is precisely not because we fully understand him, but because his image has always been contested. The Romans needed him as an embodiment of fear to justify the necessity of imperial expansion. European military strategists needed him as a tactical genius to lend classical authority to their theories. Modern North Africa needs him as an anti-colonial pioneer to anchor the historical depth of newly formed nations. Each claim is real, and each claim is incomplete. And at the intersection of all these claims stands a man we can never fully grasp. A man who, at 26, led an army across the Alps, fought for 15 years on foreign soil, and ultimately ended his life with poison in a house in Asia Minor. His true face may lie buried beneath the ashes of the Barca hill in Carthage, silent alongside the burned archives. Yet, silence itself serves as historical evidence. When we realize that the story of Hannibal we tell is almost entirely based on enemy archives, this awareness itself constitutes a critical historical consciousness. It compels us to remain skeptical of every established fact, to question the source of every vivid detail, and to examine the power structures behind every conclusion. In this sense, the story of Hannibal is not merely a biography of an ancient general. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility and bias inherent in historical writing itself. We cannot resurrect the archives of Carthage from the ashes, but we can honestly mark those gaps in our retelling. And this honesty may be the most basic respect we can offer to a civilization deprived of the right to speak for itself. This is not the end of the story, as long as there are those who ask, where is the other side of the story? The echoes of Hannibal will never truly fade away.